Everybody, welcome to the first day of a two-day hearing on Hearing Stream 2 for the Napier City Proposed District Plan. Hearing Stream 2 covers the topics of subdivision, coastal environment, earthworks, light, signs, temporary activities, natural features and landscapes, and the various bits that go with those chapters. The hearing panel for this stream is myself as the chair. To my immediate left is Commissioner Liz Lambert, and to her immediate left is Councillor and Commissioner Annette Brosnan. So welcome. We have the full suite, I think, today of the district planning team here, plus an additional reporting officer, so welcome. You'll introduce yourselves as your topic progresses, no doubt. And we're supported by Nicola, our very capable hearings administrator in the back there. Today will be a hybrid, like most times, of in-person attendances and some online ones as well. The normal earthquake and fire drills apply here. Just follow the staff, they don't know what to do. And the key thing is to make sure your phones are on silent or off, not to distract us. The mics should turn on automatically, so there shouldn't be the normal or often hassle with those today. We will first start off with the reporting officers talking to their reports and answering any questions that the panel may have immediately on hearing that. And then a little bit later, within sort of about an hour from now, we will start to hear from submitters. And as I say, we will finish about 2 o'clock today, I think. Okay. And similarly tomorrow, I think we'll finish around that time too. So, without any further ado, I will turn to the reporting officers and look to the first one. We're doing them alphabetically, so it's the coastal environment first. So, would you like to talk to us? Introduce yourself and your topics, and any other topics that you may cover off as well while you're on the podium, so to speak.
Perfect. Morena, my name is Brooke Hemmings, and I'm the author of the Coastal Environment Section 42A report. I am employed as a graduate policy planner within Napier City Council City Development Team, and my qualifications include a Bachelor of Social Science in Political Science, Education and Public Policy. I have been involved in the proposed district plan since January of this year, 2024, and while I've prepared the Section 42A report for the matters relating to the coastal environment topic, I was not involved in drafting the proposed district plan chapter or the Section 32 report. I have read the submitted evidence in relation to the coastal environment chapter, and I'm happy to take questions at the end of my statement. The coastal environment chapter addresses the preservation and sustainable management of Napier's coastal environment, aligning with the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement 2010. This chapter sets out the objectives and policies to manage subdivision, use and development in a manner that protects and enhances the natural and cultural values of the coastal environment. There were 74 submission points and 20 further submission points received regarding the coastal environment chapter. And among these submissions, the key themes included alignment with the NZCPS 2010. Several submitters, including the Department of Conservation, Forest and Bird, and a few others, highlighted that the coastal environment chapter needs to better align with the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement, specifically addressing natural character, public access, and avoiding adverse effects from inappropriate subdivision and development. The second theme that came through was significant infrastructure. Submitters such as KiwiRail and the Port of Napier suggested that the chapter more clearly acknowledges the functional and operational needs of significant infrastructure within the coastal environment, including transportation networks and ports. There were then some minor amendments suggested. Various submitters sought minor changes to the chapter, including clarifying definitions, objectives, and ensuring consistency within the language used within the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement. There were some out-of-scope requests. There were some submissions in regards to rules that sought that rules be added to the coastal environment chapter. The next one was mapping. Some submissions raised concerns about the accuracy and extent of the coastal environment mapping and requested clarity on how specific areas are categorised, particularly in respect to areas of high natural character. There was then miscellaneous, and then lastly, areas of natural character, concern about the mapping of areas with significant natural character. And I have recommended amendments based on these themes. Pre-circulated submitted evidence and statements were received from a number of submitters, and I've read this evidence and am prepared to respond to any questions or matters raised in relation to the information provided. I do believe in some cases there's scope to change, however, I wish to hear from the submitters before providing a response within my reply report. No matters have been raised by the panel in advance of this hearing, and in terms of the key matters of contention within the Coastal Environment chapter, the primary matters in contention revolve around ensuring that the chapter gives full effect to the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement 2010, particularly concerning the preservation and enhancement of natural character of the coastal environment. Additionally, the balancing of infrastructure needs, accurate mapping, and addressing climate change impacts have been key issues raised within the submissions. These matters are addressed throughout the recommended amendments of the chapter, which are outlined in Appendix A of the report. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much for that. I'll just turn to the panel first to see if there's any questions arising. Commissioner Brosnan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There was a change in point 65 of your report as a result of the Forest and Birds submission, where there was the removal of, I think it was B and D in the proposed plan, which was the restoration and rehabilitation of natural character and the removal of public access, open spaces, recreation, amenity value and bank stability and areas for treatment of stormwater. And my question is, do we think we strike the right balance there? I'm interested in the reasoning for the removal of that. Is it purely off that submission? And which point in that submission prompted that?
Yeah, sure thing. It was purely off that submission, and I'm pretty sure that was to align better with the NZCPS. However, can I get back to you on the specifics of that in my report?
Yeah, thank you. In particular, I'm just interested if we maintain the protection of those values in a different way in the chapter, if they're protected in another area. Thank you.
Yeah, do you mind if I get back?
Absolutely, thank you.
So just to clarify, what were you looking for?
So it's policy 14. I'm just looking for some clarity around the removal of B and D in the proposed plan and whether those values are protected in another area that I haven't been able to see. Thank you.
Just a couple of minor ones. You recommend deleting all of the cross-referencing right at the start of the chapter around other district plan provisions. Would that be consistent with the approach used for those other sort of district-wide topics, just to keep a sort of blank?
Yeah, that's
mention?
the consistent approach that we've decided to take for the district-wide matters.
Okay. Because one thought occurred to me that it might be quite useful to highlight those particular matters where there might be some clear cross-referencing needed by a district plan user for things, and I'm thinking of subdivision earthworks and those sorts of things where it might be useful just to flag to plan users who should really have a look over here. Okay, thank you. Your recommendations on policy 3. I'm just wondering, so I'm just scrolling to it. Which will be policy 2 if we delete policy 1. It's to say to identify, protect and preserve, and I'm just wondering whether that's a little protect and preserve. Can you just maybe explain why both of those terms are necessary in the policy?
Yeah, sure. Do you mind if I pass that on to?
Sure.
Fleur?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'd need to have a little bit closer look at this, but I think it was really around trying to align the terminology with the NZC, CPS. But yes, I mean, protect and preserve, they do have similar, I guess, definitions, I guess. So, yeah, we can certainly look into that a little bit more closely and come back to you if it helps.
I think so. I mean, on the other hand, it may not hurt, but and I can see that Policy 3 conflates a number of NZCPS kind of things together. That's probably where the language conflation comes in as well.
Okay, so just to be clear, your preference is to
It's not a preference necessarily. If there's a good reason for having them there, then
Yes.
that's fine.
Okay.
Just kind of initial reading just feels like it's overkill to protect and preserve.
Sure, okay, so we can provide some clarification on that.
Thank you. Okay, that's all the questions I have at the moment. Any further questions from the panel?
When do we accept that submission? In mass? No, I just...
Possibly
Okay, that's
later. Yeah, no. Thank you. Turn to the next topic.
Thank you. Morning, everyone. My name is Lily Lawson, and I am employed as an associate planner at Barker and Associates, and as a consultant planner to Napier City Council and the reporting officer for the Earthworks chapter of the PDP. My qualifications include a Bachelor of Urban Planning with honours. I have over 8 years' experience working as a resource management planner, including various resource management positions in local government, levy organisations and private consultancy. I was not involved in the drafting of the Earthworks chapter, but prepared the Section 42A report for the matters relating to all earthworks provisions. In preparation for the reporting, I have reviewed the Section 32 report and the Napier City Operative Plan Earthworks chapter. No pre-hearing meetings with submitters were held in relation to submissions on this chapter. I would be happy to take any questions you have at the end of my statement. A range of issues and interests were raised by parties in the submissions on most provisions of the Earthworks chapter. In total, there were 89 submission points and 37 further submission points. These were grouped under the following headings in my hearings report: submissions on plan structure, submissions on introduction issues, objectives and policies, submissions on rule framework, notification, activity status and permitted activity standards, and general and miscellaneous submissions. I expand on the key themes of submissions below and comment on whether the matter has been pursued in evidence. I am aware that evidence has been received by the following parties: Hawke's Bay Airport, Horticulture New Zealand, Hawke's Bay Regional Council, the fuel companies, Kiwi Rail Holdings, NZTA, Ravensdown, Talco, Transpower, Heritage New Zealand, and Kāinga Ora and Sarah Chambers with late evidence. I have reviewed this evidence and will consider that presented here today to inform a revised position to be circulated after the hearing. My opening statement concludes by listing those matters of contentions that remain. Plan structure. The location of the earthworks provisions relating to network utilities was an issue raised by network utility providers Transpower and Talco. They sought the centralisation of all network utilities provisions into the network utilities chapter, including relevant earthworks provisions. This matter has been pursued by Talco in evidence, with their preference remaining that earthworks provisions relating to network utilities be located in the NU chapter. Kiwi Rail accept the approach to address rules relating to earthworks within CNL's, SCFs, ONFs and SNAs in the network utilities chapter, but reserve the right to comment on the cross-referencing between chapters as required by Regulation 30 of the National Planning Standards. On the basis that the earthwork provisions relating to network utilities remain in the earthworks chapter, Transpower have provided suggested changes to the NU chapter to address the relationship between the chapters. Objectives. Changes were sought to the objectives primarily from environmental interest groups seeking expansion of the areas and features included in EWOT and protection of river extent and values. The majority of submitters who sought changes to the objectives have either accepted my recommendations or have not pursued their submission through evidence. KiwiRail opposed the relief sought by Forest and Bird to broaden the areas in which EWO2 applied. In particular, they opposed the inclusion of the coastal environment, which I considered necessary to give effect to the NZCPS. KiwiRail continued to pursue the relief sought in its further submission to provide for earthworks in or near the existing rail corridor in the coastal environment that are necessary to provide for rail-related activities. Policies. A new policy was sought by Horticulture New Zealand that recognises the beneficial outcomes of earthworks in providing for people and communities' social, economic and cultural well-being, including ancillary rural earthworks, where adverse effects are appropriately managed. They have pursued this matter in evidence. Changes were sought to Heritage New Zealand to EWP 6 to specifically reference the control of earthworks on sites containing scheduled heritage items. Heritage New Zealand have accepted my recommendations and have not pursued this matter. Changes were sought by Forest and Bird to EWP2, P3 and P7. These changes sought to broaden the areas in which the policy applied, as well as a change in policy directive from enabling to provide for, with additional caveats. I recommended changes to EWP2 and P3. KiwiRail consider a managed directive to EWP3 instead of the avoid or mitigate directive as recommended in the Section 42 report would provide a more appropriate balance. Activity status. HBRC and Forest and Bird both sought more restrictive activity statuses for earthwork activities within the coastal environment. HBRC sought this in regard to EWR6, earthworks associated with the renourishment of the coastal environment. Forest and Bird sought a non-compliant activity status for earthworks in SCLs, ONFs, SCFs, SNAs and the coastal environment. My Section 42 recommendations did not include any changes to activity status, but that I would consider evidence put forward by the respective parties. Forest and Bird have not pursued the matter through evidence. HBRC have provided evidence on this matter and considered that, as notified, EWR6 is inconsistent with the RCEP. New rules. 3 new rules were sought relating to ancillary rural earthworks, burial of unwanted organisms by Horticulture New Zealand, and earthworks within the National Grid Yard. As I recommended a new rule for earthworks within the National Grid Yard in accordance with that put forward by Transpower, the submitter has accepted my recommendations and has not addressed this further in evidence. Regarding the new rules sought by Horticulture New Zealand, they have submitted detailed evidence on this matter. Rules. R1. There were a number of changes sought to EWR1. The changes sought included minor changes to the maximum permitted thresholds for the industrial, commercial and residential zones, and applicable thresholds for the settlement and Ahuriri Estuary Special Zone. I did not form a recommendation on amended volume limit, as there was insufficient evidence to recommend a specific volume threshold. However, following an assessment of the operative provisions, I concluded that the proposed district plan provision was more stringent than the operative provisions for earthworks relating to building activities. Ravensdown has pursued this matter. I note that Ravensdown has sought 500 metres cubed, which is a revised volume from that sought in submission. Matters of discretion. Fuel companies sought an additional matter of discretion to recognise the benefits associated with earthworks. They have accepted my recommendations and have not pursued the matter further in evidence. Standards. A number of submissions were received on the earthwork standards. These were generally from parties with development or network utility interests and primarily were sought for practicality reasons or consistent with national policy statements. Ravensdown have pursued their relief regarding the maximum permitted volume in EWS1 and seek a revised limit of 500 metres cubed. Kāinga Ora has also sought 250 metres cubed for the standard. Talco have revised the relief sought regarding EWS2 and in particular the setbacks required from streams or flood protection works for cut and fill. They agree with my assessment that trenching could result in adverse effects, but consider that exceptions for infrastructure installed by a trenchless method is appropriate and will not result in such effects. General submissions. General submissions primarily related to the timing of the notification of the Eco Sites of Significance to Māori and Natural Hazards chapter and their relationship with the Earthworks chapter. These general submissions have not been pursued through evidence with the exception of Sarah Chambers, which was received on Friday. The remaining issues of contention are the location of earthwork provisions relating to network utilities within the plan pursued by Talco, a policy and rule framework which provides for ancillary rural earthworks and the burial of unwanted organisms as a permitted activity pursued by Horticulture New Zealand, EWO2 pursued by Kiwi Rail seeking provision of earthworks within the coastal environment for network utilities. Specifically, they oppose the inclusion of coastal environment. The policy directive in EWP3 pursued by Kiwi Rail, threshold limits for EWR1 and S1 pursued by Ravensdown and Kāinga, EWR6 earthworks in the coastal environment pursued by Hawke's Bay Regional Council, and EWS2 pursued by Talco seeking exceptions to setbacks for infrastructure installation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just initially, before I turn to the panel, the evidence received so far, have you considered that the evidence you've been put forward to you?
I have considered it. I haven't formed a revised recommendation, but I'm in a position to discuss the evidence, yes.
That's right. So in terms of the evidence, say, from the telecommunications firms and things, you still haven't come to any conclusion about
No,
earthworks for them? Okay.
no, but yeah, I guess I would have preliminary thoughts and was going to listen to that presented today.
Okay, because I think it's important that if you have changed your views about anything on these matters, is to put that now so that when we come to those submitters, they're aware of your change in position, if there is any. So thank you for that. I'll turn to the panel. Commissioner Lambert.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. Thank you very much, Ms Lawson. You raised in your summary really the one of the matters around particularly of concern to the network utilities around earthworks and where they should most appropriately be located, and you've concluded that they should remain in the earthworks chapter. What I've been getting, excuse me, what I was in several of the reports is sort of mixed messages around that. And because in some places, for example, the natural features and landscape section, there's been a recommendation that that should be governed by the, included in the network utilities chapter. So I'm really, this is probably not just a question for you, it's for more broadly for the relevant reporting officers around, I guess, we haven't discussed it at all, but obviously we will, about that consistency in terms of network utilities. So not necessarily asking you for an answer right now, but just raising that as an issue that has come through.
Yes.
And reading all the Section 42A reports. And I've no doubt it'll probably be raised again by some of those network utility submitters.
Yes.
So, but unless any Paulina or anyone else has got any comment on that, now I'm happy just to raise that as something that we discuss later on.
Yes, and I think in terms of my position, I'm certainly not opposed to them being moved. My Section 42 stated that the national planning standards didn't explicitly require it, but actually it's really important for the plan to be consistent in its approach.
Yeah. Thank you.
And just on that point, yes, we'll be asking Mr Anderson around how other plans have dealt with this whole consistency issue. But as you point out, I think it's very important for the plan to be consistent, whether it's network utilities are fairly contained and that's where you look for everything,
Yeah.
or you take a wider, you have to take a wider look, so.
I do have one more really minor issue, and really minor. EWO4, you talk about floor protection duties, it should be flood.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's right.
Commissioner Brosnan?
Thank you very much, Ms Lawson, for your report. One of the questions I had was around the wide acceptance of the submission point around the benefits associated with earthworks being added to the matters of discretion. And I just wonder if you had any further comment to share with us on that. In particular, I don't think it's been raised as a further submission point by any other submitters. And I am interested because it is quite a wide application across the rules, whether or not you were quite comfortable accepting that recommendation, you don't see it.
Yeah, I think the nature of earthworks is that they are necessary for development and for things to happen, and that the objectives certainly recognise that. And I thought it was appropriate that the provisions provided an opportunity for the benefits of earthworks to be considered, and that the standards and rules work as a package to manage the effects, and the matters of discretion provide an opportunity to also consider those benefits associated with it.
Thank you. And so just reading, I guess, through your report where you talk about that, my initial thinking was that the purpose of the standard would be broad enough to allow for you to consider the benefits of the earthworks themselves, but you do think it needs to be.
Yeah, I think the purposes of the standards generally relate to a specific effect that is trying to be managed, rather than considering any potential benefits.
Thank you.
Thank you. Firstly, a very minor question out of interest. You say in your experience you've had resource management positions in levy organisations. Can you just explain what that means?
Sure thing. I worked for Beef and Lamb New Zealand, so it's a levy-based organisation
All right.
where farmers pay a levy, and where we were governed under the Levies Act to represent farmers' interests in various planning processes.
Okay. Thank you. Can you just for me, now this is for someone who doesn't live in Napier, you talk in EWO4, Objective 4, about river control and drainage, about re-nourishment of material along the coast. Can you just explain to me what that incurs in terms of locally?
Yeah, I understood this objective too, and there's the corresponding policy and rule framework is limited to local authorities, so it's work required by local authorities within the coastal environment. That is the extent of my knowledge on it. It has come from the operative plan, and Hawke's Bay Regional Council have sought some changes to the rule framework in terms of activity status, because they think, as notified, it's inconsistent with their regional coastal environment plan. So that is one of the matters of contention, yeah.
Thank
I
you.
guess on that, I would support any changes to make it more consistent.
Right.
But it hasn't changed from the operative provisions. So obviously, if it is consistent, it's a historic inconsistency.
No, thank you. I'll probably be asking the same question of the regional councils when they attend as well. Just to clarify that. Can you answer that question? Just in paragraph 212 of your section 42A report, just a little clarification in terminology, really. At the top of the page there, page 38, you refer to adjacent site or allotments. This is about earthworks management and sediment control and things. I just want to be clear about this, because in my experience, adjacent and adjoining don't mean the same thing. And it can be quite important, can be totally irrelevant, but can be very relevant. Adjacent doesn't necessarily mean adjoining. It could be something nearby, but not there. And that can be quite important when it comes to rules or standards which seek to be sort of permitted. You have to know what adjacent means. So I'm not expecting to answer that question now, but just to revisit that, do you mean adjacent, and how do you define adjacent if you do mean that as a standard?
Yeah, thank you. That's helpful. I'll look.
Okay, thank you. Just on the same page, paragraph 215, in reference to the airport submission about this, they want, and I couldn't find it followed through with the airport either at the moment, but they refer to standing pools, remediate any standing pools of water, etc., etc. And obviously they're concerned with bird strike on planes and things, but I couldn't find that followed through any of the standards about standing pools and things like that.
Yes, I think that was an error in my track changes, and that it was intended to be put through. And if I recall correctly, Hawke's Bay Airport has addressed that in the evidence. So it would just be a minor amendment of pulling that through to the track change provisions.
Right. Thank you. In paragraph 248 on page 42, this is something you may want to think about again. You're recommending a change to the clause C, where it says there are no requirements in the case of archaeological sites that are not of Maori origin and not covered by the Heritage Act. And there's a lot of negativity in that clause, and it took me a while to understand what it was saying. So I'm just wondering whether there's a better way of dealing with the negativity in that paragraph and just
Yeah,
ask them what it means.
sure thing. I can look at that. That was adopted from the submission
Right.
and specific relief sought by Heritage New Zealand, but I agree.
Okay.
So I can look in that and see if it can be made clearer.
Okay, that's all the questions I have. Any further questions from the panel? Thank you very much, Mr. Lawson.
Thank you.
Thanks. Cheryl? So we're talking about light now?
Yes, light. I do have, excuse me, I do have 3 other chapters as well, and I'm happy to take a break in between so that you can ask questions related to each chapter if that works.
Yeah, we'll hear you talk about light first,
Okay.
and ask any questions, and then
Yep.
ditto the next.
All right, Morena, my name is Jeriel Sargent. I'm employed as a policy analyst within Napier City Council's City Development team. My qualifications include a Bachelor of Business Studies and a Master of Public Policy. I have 2 years working experience in resource management policy in local government. I have been working on the review of the proposed district plan since 2022. I contributed to finalising these general district-wide matters chapters and the Section 32 reports for natural features and landscapes, as well as the light chapters, while the previous authors prepared the science and temporary activities chapters. A topic overview. The NFL, science, temporary activities and light chapters are part of the district-wide matters in the PDP, each with a comprehensive policy framework to address cross-district issues. The light chapter primarily manages artificial light to balance safety, operational needs and amenity. It addresses light, spill, glare and environmental impacts while supporting transport, industrial and public safety requirements. The NFL chapter focuses on protecting the 3 classifications in Napier: outstanding natural features, special character landscapes, and, sorry, that's incorrect in my text, but special character features as well. Its purpose is to safeguard the natural values while managing compatible development. The signs chapter balances the functional need for signage with visual amenity, heritage protection, and transport safety. It includes rules on size, placement, illumination to ensure that signage aligns with Napier's character and safety standards. The temporary activities chapter facilitates appropriate activities such as events and construction, while managing their impacts on noise, light spill, and the environment, transport networks, and community wellbeing. On the light chapter, the matters raised in submissions. The light chapter received 16 submissions, raising 43 submission points and a further 19 further submissions, addressing operational needs, amenity, character, biodiversity, and some commentary on specific provisions. The first point, operational needs, submitters including the Port of Napier, Kiwi Rail and Ravensdown emphasise the importance of artificial lighting for operational and safety purposes such as maritime, rail and aircraft safety. Hawke's Bay Airport Limited sought stronger references to aircraft safety in the OBS and POLs. I recommended amending light Objective 2 to explicitly address aircraft safety as part of the broader transport network. Recommended changes also included provisions for rail signals and emergency maintenance lighting to reflect critical infrastructure requirements. Amenity and character. Submitters raised concerns about balancing lighting's operational importance while preserving residential and special use zone character. I recommended refining light spill and glare standards in Light S1, introducing exemptions for health and safety lighting, and extending lighting allowances for the stadium zone events to midnight for up to 5 days annually. These recommendations sought to align the provisions with what is already occurring appropriately, like lighting to pack down an event or to clarify the intent of the standard. Biodiversity. DOC highlighted the adverse effects of artificial lighting on Indigenous biodiversity, including the threatened long-tailed bat. I deferred the specific provisions to the upcoming ecosystems and Indigenous biodiversity variation. Special purpose zone provisions. Submissions sought clarifications on safety related to lighting, and requested updates to address special purpose zones. I recommended that amendments to explicitly recognise rail and maintenance lighting and rules, to clarify light spill thresholds and to align lighting standards in the port zone with those in industrial and commercial zones, so not to impose new impacts on additional residential areas. That's the lighting section.
Okay, thank you. Before I turn to the panel, just one broader question, and you do refer to, well, DOC's concern around the effects of lighting on bats, but and you refer to the variation. When you wrote the report, it was a forthcoming plan variation, but it's now been notified. And I think this is a general question across the board where reporting officers have referred to the forthcoming plan variation. I think this is in response or in reply. I mean, for instance, and I haven't looked at the eco variation as notified, does it address light effects and concerns or need it? Is that cross-plan integration issue, really?
Yeah, that's a great point. That's something we considered. The variation as notified was only the chapter, and so the plan is to address these and other submission points that have been deferred at the hearing stage. So when I'm preparing the Section 42 report for the eco chapter, it will include reference to the submission points that have been deferred. So that's how we're hoping to achieve that cross-plan consistency rather than at this stage.
Okay, so as it's notified, it doesn't include any rules or anything?
It's only the eco chapter that's been notified.
Right. So is it expecting that submissions on the variation, they can address rule issues, or is reliance on submissions to the PDP as notified
Do you mean rule issues in other parts of the plan?
Yeah, if there's no rules, if submitters raise the question of rules in relation to the variation, that is how it is to be addressed, or I'm just trying to see the relationship between the variation and these hearings.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's right. That is how it was intended to be addressed, that through the variation they could provide comment on the other rules, but primarily the commentary that's been provided so far and has been deferred would be addressed at the hearing stage, with any further commentary that would be provided on this consultation that's happening right now, submission period.
Right,
Yeah.
okay. Any questions from the panel on light?
Seem
I will confess, so just a recent proceedings I was held, light was probably the number one issue. Illumination of a building overnight, and the plan provisions were brand new around light, and there was all sorts of rules and standards around light glow and all sorts of things. So in many ways, this is a much simpler approach to dealing with light. To do with that. Just a minor questions around, you're recommending with policy P3 that the reference to the lights of vehicles, trains and aircraft be removed as being because it's redundant. Part of me is questioning, well, is it redundant because lights of those things can come off as issues for proposals, where, you know, car lights, for instance, can quite often be an issue raised in sense. And you could say the same with traffic and rail signals in many ways, that it's redundant because they're managed under other legislative controls and things like that. So I'm just wondering whether that, I can see the point you're making, but whether there's a need to at least say that generally the positive effects of those things being taken into account.
Yeah.
No, it's just open-ended question, really.
Yeah, certainly. And it definitely, as you said, it's something that we considered. The reason I took the stance that I did in this report is because of consistency with those other parent legislation or the other things that regulate those types of lights anyway. But I do note that a couple of the submitters have raised they would like it to be reinserted. So
Right.
I'm aware, yeah.
Okay, it's just for future consent hearings and things that may become an issue. And just on the same policy, you're recommending adding in response to I think Kiwi Rail, adding the maintenance for the transport network as in relation to temporary lighting. So you often will have temporary lighting for other purposes as well, and I'm thinking temporary activities, events and things. I'm thinking construction projects, things like that. Are you fairly confident that that's the sort of the scope of the temporary lighting that should be covered by this policy?
Yeah, I do, at the time of writing this, I did consider that the lights that would occur from events and construction were already taken care of, and this area of maintenance of the either any part of the transport network wasn't addressed because it might not fall under either of those activities. So that's why I did include it. I wouldn't say fully confident that that's that's the scope. So I'm open to changing that if you'd interpret it differently.
So maybe I'll reserve the right for you to just reconsider that, just to make sure
Certainly.
you're confident that it's covered elsewhere in the plan. Thank you. Okay, that's all the questions I have. Any further questions from the panel? Thank you.
Would you like me to continue?
Yes, please. Next topic.
The next one I have is natural features and landscapes, the matters raised in submissions. The NFL chapter received 9 submissions, raising 57 submission points and 10 further submission points. Submitters raised issues regarding urban and modified landscapes, consistency across provisions and operational needs, and the management and protection of natural features. Recognition of urban and modified landscapes. So submissions including from the airport sought recognition of urban and modified features like airports and business parks within the special character landscape overlay. That's number 1. In contrast, Forest and Bird called for additional protection of outstanding natural landscapes and outstanding natural features. I recommended retaining the chapter's focus on natural and cultural values within urban and modified features, better addressed in other chapters, such as the special purpose airport zone. Consistency and clarity in chapter provisions. Submitters emphasised the need to clarify the overlap between the NFL and other provisions such as the airport zone and the network utilities chapter. Errors in schedules and references were also noted. I recommended that amendments to clarify that the NFL provisions do not apply within these zones and supported minor corrections to improve accuracy and usability, and I'm happy to clarify the question that was raised as well. Enabling network utilities, utility providers including Transpower and KiwiRail sought recognition of operational needs and suggested managing utilities within ONFs, CSFs and CSLs through the NU chapter instead of through the NFL chapter. I supported relocating relevant provisions to streamline management while ensuring that the significant landscapes remained protected. Management of buildings and structures. Submitters proposed stricter standards for building materials reflecting reflectance values and blanket prohibitions in the coastal environment or significant view shafts. I recommended clarifying reflectance values and incorporating view shafts into the assessment criteria, but did not endorse broader rules as the existing provisions provided an appropriate balance between development and landscape protection. Greater protection of natural features and landscapes. Forest and Bird called for stricter controls on earthwork subdivisions and extractive industries in coastal areas and in special character landscapes. I supported aligning the policies with the NZCPS to strengthen the coastal special character landscape protections and avoiding significant adverse effects. However, I did not recommend a blanket prohibition or non-complying status for earthworks as existing safeguards were sufficient. Integration with biodiversity protection. Again, submitters have emphasised the importance of addressing Indigenous biodiversity on outstanding natural features and the coastal environment, and I recommended deferring these issues to the eco-variation. The remaining matters of contention is the Hawke's Bay Airport's request of recognition of urban features within the special character landscape, where I retained the focus on natural values, addressing urban features in other chapters. Forest and Bird proposed stricter controls and blanket prohibitions on earthworks. I declined, finding the existing provisions sufficient. And submitters sought clearer standards for natural building materials and reflectance values. I supported minor clarifications, but not a new standard.
Okay, thank you. A couple of questions from me first. One is in relation to the point raised by Commissioner Lambert, really. In paragraph 51, you refer to, this is the issue about network utilities again, and you're recommending or indicating you prefer, clearly indicating that network utilities are governed by the network utilities chapter. And again, I'm not asking a question there. I think it's that broader question about the approach of the plan across these topics. Unless there's a question there. And the only other thing too is now we haven't yet heard the submissions on the airport zone and the like, but I was just a little bit intrigued to understand, because you talk about visual corridors, significant visual corridors, and that's only, as I read the plan, in relation to views across the airport from certain vantage points, isn't it? There's no other visual corridors within the city or anything.
No.
It's just those two. Could you just explain the background to them, if you can?
Certainly. So the incorporation of the view shafts, like you said, is only in the airport zone because the intent at the time of notification was to acknowledge that the airport does hold a special character landscape and special character features around it. So while there was hesitation to apply the same level of restriction because it's not that Section 6 threshold, there was an appetite to maintain those visual amenity factors by protecting those certain corridors. The reason it was put only for that was because of the mapping of the other special character landscapes and features, and there weren't other mapping that interacted with such an important piece of infrastructure in the same way. So that was the reason that it was kept. And the reason I discuss it in this is in response to a submission, but also noting that the airport zone are preparing to submit on their own chapter, and they have addressed they're seeking a change in the view shafts as well. So they have provided it as supplementary evidence to this. So while I am not addressing it in this 42A, I'm mindful that if that change was accepted, it would require some reconsideration of this chapter as well. So that's a bit of background of where it is and also what might happen in the future.
Okay. So did these corridors and landscape-sensitive control areas, did they arise from that citywide landscape study?
No,
They're
this
not.
was afterwards.
Afterwards.
Mhm.
Can you tell me the derivation of how they came about? Because if they don't apply to any other part of the city but here, so I'm just interested how that occurred.
I can turn to Paulina as well if there's any additional context, but it was the matter of the assessment was done in 2020, identified all the landscapes, and then preparing the airport special purpose zone and the NFL for notification is when the view shafts were done. They were made by a landscape architect in collaboration with council and the airport for the purpose of protecting those views that the airports interacted with. And so that's why it was done afterwards with the consideration of the assessment that was done in 2020. Was there anything you wanted to add, Paulina?
Yes, I would like to add as well. Yeah, so that was in relation to the submission from the airport, and they consider really they wanted to acknowledge the significance of the airport in relation to that landscape. The report didn't talk in detail about where those view shafts were, and through consecutive engagement with the airport, we identified, okay, we will do those. Get a landscape architect to identify those in more detail, those view shafts, and that's what we included in the notified version, in the section 42.
Okay, thank you. And a little bit, I mean, no doubt we'll hear more evidence on this topic, but this is a language question. You refer there about significant visual corridors, but the plan itself, it doesn't use the word corridor, it uses view shafts.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, that would be an error, and I'm happy to amend that.
Right,
Yep.
just to, as long as there's this consistency in the actual district plan provisions on that topic. Any further questions from the panel on this topic?
Yeah, just thank you. Just following up still around the special airport purpose side, I'm still a little bit confused. And I've read it a few times. I mean, I understand what was asked for by the Hawke's Bay Airport, what they submitted on, what they actually proposed as an amendment. And you've accepted that in part, or you've recommended that it be accepted in part, I should say. So I guess I just want to really understand then which bit has primacy, if you're not, is it the special airport zone or the outstanding natural features and landscape overlay?
It was considered at the time that the airport zone would be treated differently. So technically, yes, at this time it has primacy because of the incorporation of the view shafts.
Yes.
And that is the only, those landscapes that have been considered are the only ones that would be affected by it anyway.
Thank you. And look, just one other observation, again, we're getting rules around earthworks, outside of the earthworks chapter, and I understand, why it's for outstanding natural features, but again, it just comes back to that discussion that we've already been having about the appropriate placement of some of these provisions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Through you, Mr. Chair, just a very minor comment, and it's a spelling one. In the proposed changes under landscape values, MFL-AC1, your proposed amendment says voided instead of avoided.
Thank you. Noted.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think we can move on to, I'm just aware of the time. We are a little bit over. Who was our first submitter? All right. I'm aware they have another obligation at 11 o'clock, so hopefully we can get through the next few reports fairly quickly. So, next topic.
Okay, my next topic is signs. Sorry, I've confused myself. All right, the matters raised in submissions. The matters in the signs chapter received 40 submissions and 4 further submission points with additional points relating to the definition of signs. A key point was the enabling of signs where appropriate. Submitters, including Heritage New Zealand, sought stronger objectives for heritage signers, while oOh!media proposed specific rules for network utility advertising. I retained the existing objectives and policies, adding a new objective to explicitly protect heritage values and ensure alignment with the Napier City Historic Heritage Precinct. Proposals for new policies specific to signage network utilities were declined as existing provisions were sufficient to manage signage effects. Signs in special zones, that's port and airport zones. Concerns were raised about restricted provisions for signage in the port zone and airport zone. I recommended aligning standards in these zones with industrial zones, permitting freestanding signs subject to the established standards. Overly restrictive, non-complying statuses were amended to recognise the operational needs while maintaining control. Protecting the transport network, submitters including NZTA, Kiwi Rail requested stricter controls on digital flashing and highway visible signage to ensure transport safety. I recommended amendments to sign Objective 2 to emphasise transport safety and include stricter digital signage rules, including limits on dwell times, content and transitions. I accepted the relief sought to require consultation with NZTA and Kiwi Rail for signage visible from the state highways or rail corridors. Standards for parks and open spaces. Submitters proposed clearer rules for signs in parks and reserves, highlighting public safety and wayfinding needs. I considered it appropriate to amend and add specific rules for official signs in these areas, ensuring compliance with safety requirements and aligned sign areas standards in open space zones with those in the sport and active rec zones for consistency. Managing digital and illuminated signs. Concerns were raised about the risks posed by digital and illuminated signs near transport corridors. I recommended amending sign standard 4 by adding a criteria for dwell times, content transitions, along with a fail-safe mechanism for malfunctions. Illuminated signs that obstructed or distracted drivers or rail operators were amended to ensure transport safety. Telco proposed amendments to include provision in the definition related to infrastructure. I retained the definition as notified as it aligns with the mandatory planning standards. The remaining matters of contention are that oOh!media requested specific policies for network utility advertising, and I consider that the current provisions are sufficient. Golden Bay and Hawke's Bay Airport Limited propose more flexible sign rules for the port and airport zone. I allowed some flexibility but didn't fully adopt their suggestions. And Sarah Chambers sought stricter rules on balloon signage, and I consider that the existing rules are effective and do not recommend any additional restrictions for balloon signage.
Okay, thank you. Any questions on signs?
No, very clear.
Just a couple of minor ones, really. You're recommending a new sign objective. Let me scroll to it. Around heritage. It's in response to the heritage question. And again, this is a language question. Sorry about my pedantic nature. You got signs located on heritage buildings. Is that a defined term in the district plan, a heritage building? It's clear what it means by heritage building. It's scheduled. Okay.
Sorry, I'd just like to add to that. I think it would be helpful to reference a particular schedule because there are I guess, heritage buildings located within different schedules, and so we'd need to provide clarity. I think it would be helpful to add that.
Okay, that sounds a good idea. Thank you. And the only other question I have, were you recommending deleting Rule 26? Just quickly scrolling to it. And this is the one, the catch-all one for as a non-complying. Are you confident that there is no need for a catch-all rule around signs? All permutations and possibilities covered off by the other rules?
I would be open to reconsidering my recommendation in this.
Just to be sure.
Yeah.
Because sometimes it's good to have that
Yeah.
net at the end of the barrel. Okay. Any other questions on signs? No? Okay, barreling through. Next topic, is it temporary activities? Yes,
That's
okay.
my final topic. Temporary activities, the matters raised in submissions, a total of 13 submissions raised, 22 submission points and 14 further submission points. The first point is enabling temporary activities. Submitters broadly supported objectives, objective 1 and 2, which recognise the importance of temporary activities. I recommended to retain these with the inclusion of references to the environment, aligning with biodiversity and natural resource management requests. Waka Kotahi did request the inclusion of a new objective to address traffic safety during temporary events. I expanded the scope of temporary objective 5 to encompass the entire transport network. Temporary buildings and structures submissions included requests to extend the time frame for temporary structures from 12 to 18 months and increase the size limits. I recommended to reject this due to extended timeframes could lead to sustained impacts on the neighbours and the environment. I support Waka Kotahi's suggestion to include a note requiring NZTA approval for construction near state highways for clarity and practicality. I also recommended expanding the matters of discretion in Temp R1 to address broader adverse effects on the environment. Temporary noise events, submitters raised concerns about the duration and impact of noise events, particularly in noise-sensitive areas like the Marine Parade Recreation Control Area. I recommended also moving stadium-specific rules to the stadium zone chapter for clarity and reducing maximum allowable durations in sensitive areas to minimise the adverse effects. Napier City Council's event manager also proposed extending the duration of temporary structures used for events to ensure they match operational needs while retaining the event limits and height restrictions to protect community amenity. And finally, emergency services training. The FENS sought provisions for emergency services training. I recommended including a new rule permitting activities across all zones subject to compliance with height, yard, noise and noise standards. I also suggested clarifying activity duration and hours to ensure that it's effectively managed. The remaining matters of contention are the extended time for temporary structures. I recommended rejecting the allowable time frame from 12 to 18 months. Military training, Sarah Chambers sought stricter restrictions on residential areas and notification requirements for neighbours. I didn't support these changes as councils are obligated to provide for these activities. And emergency services training, FENS sought the blanket permitted activity status with no conditions, which I accepted in part subject to the conditions which I put in.
Okay, thank you. I have no questions. Aaron?
Just a couple. Has there been any consideration given to including a definition of temporary activities in the plan?
That is something that has come up. It wasn't within the scope of any of the submissions, so it hasn't been addressed.
So actually moving on to within the scope of all of this, and you did reference this just a few minutes ago around temp objective 5, which you've expanded to include the whole traffic network on the basis of Kotahi's submission. Are you satisfied that that is within scope of their submission? I understand why you've done it, that the issue addressed the broader network, the objective didn't. not arguing against the need for it,
Yeah.
it's just, are you satisfied that it's within scope?
Yeah, I am satisfied that it's.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Any questions? Thank you. Thank you very much for that. And I think the final topic, subdivision.
Oh, kia ora, good morning. I'll be doing subdivision topic. My name's Connie Mills. I'm employed as the strategic planning lead within Napier City Council's city development team. I have a Bachelor in Science and then a Master's in Planning. I've over 7 years experience working as a resource management planner. I've had various roles, mainly within local government, part within central government agencies and then in consultancy. I have been involved in the proposed district plan since March of this year. I was not involved in drafting the subdivision chapter, but I have prepared the Section 42 report for subdivision. Subdivision drew a lot of attention. We had 244 submission points and a further 122 further submissions. I note that subdivision applies across the district, and I've addressed the submission points in a variety of ways, particularly definitions, general matters, network utilities, urban subdivision, rural subdivision, and then subdivision involving historic and biodiverse features. Though we didn't hold any formal pre-hearing meetings, I did reach out to some submitters to figure out if we could reach consensus prior to the hearing. This is with Emerald Hills, Transpower, the telecommunication companies, and Unison, and also Hawke's Bay Regional Council. I've read all the evidence pre-circulated prior to today's hearings, and I believe that in some cases there is scope to make amendments to the subdivision chapter, and I'll be keen to hear from people today, and I'd welcome any opportunity to talk with the panel about these amendments. I note the planning evidence from Pauline Whitney with Transpower. I think they have provided sufficient further evidence, a Section 32 report, and further clarification on what they request, and I concur with their amendments now. Further with Emerald Hills Joint Venture Limited, I think there's so much scope here to enable structure plan development, different pathways than just the subdivision chapter. We have been talking last week, but we didn't quite get to a resolution, and I'd really love the opportunity to keep going there. I think we're really close. Since the publishing of this opening statement, I've also been in touch with the telecommunication companies, Hawke's Bay Regional Council and Unison, and I concur with all of their positions on the subdivision chapter as well. Just on the Unison part, provided they provide mapping, is where I can concur with them. The key issues within the 42 report and then further expanded in evidence relates to minimum lot size, specifically rural lifestyle and then throughout the residential zone chapters, reverse sensitivity protections, and then the management of urban intensification, specifically on highly productive land where there's infrastructure capacity and constraints and community character. I note that I made an error. I recommended to delete provision sub dash S6, the standard, and that standard was to do with the number of allotments. I did recommend deletion, but didn't show it in my track changes, so I'm sorry about that. I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you. Good questions.
Just one from me, please. I've got your report open at paragraph 47, which is sub-S8 building platforms, and look, I can't remember because I didn't write it down, but it may have been in other parts of your report as well. It's just a question around the 1% AEP, the annual exceeds probability. Is there a reference date for that or a reference source for that information? Given that it's a standard, because that does change. So I'm just wondering, should there be, and maybe you just might want to consider, should there be a reference to a particular source of that information or a date of that information?
I think you bring up a really good point, and I think you could do it both ways as well, so it'd be great if I could consider both options and come back to you.
Cool, thank you.
Questions? Just talk about the issue around the HDR zone, high density residential zone, and you flagging that this matter would benefit from further discussion, and you talk about a number of points around this topic. Has there been any evidence produced by submitters that you want to respond to right now?
Yeah,
You don't
so
want this-
Kāinga Ora brought it up as well, and I think where they arrived at, I understand that they support a larger high-density residential minimum lot size, and I think they put forward 120 metres squared. I think that's a great starting point, and I agree with that, for sure.
Okay, but you still want to defer until that hearing on that rezoning?
Yeah, I think there's benefit in terms of the residential zone chapters, just to make sure that the bulk and location really does marry up with the subdivision minimum lot size.
Okay, thank you. In paragraph 129 on page 37, you're talking about information on building platform, earthworks for building platform, and you say this may necessitate additional land use consent secured through a consent notice or similar mechanism. Could you just elucidate a little bit more on what you mean by that?
This is to do with earthworks, I understand, and that was further addressed in evidence by the submitter as well. That there's preference to not always provide earthwork information at subdivision stage. That was opposed by Regional Council, and I agree with Regional Council that at subdivision we should always demonstrate that there is a viable building platform, and sometimes that involves substantial earthworks. And so to not include it at subdivision stage, you're really kind of doing like an ear in the wind for some properties, particularly in Taradale and Variety Hills, that where the slope is excessive, we've got earthwork provisions that you'd really need to go and get a land use consent. So we're deferring that obligation away from the developer and then onto the future landowner. And I don't think that's fair. I think you really need to have a property that can be viably developed. If they choose not to use that development platform, good for them. But I think at subdivision we should be very clear that it is viable.
Right, so you're saying that the sort of onus would be put on future land, the property owner, and if they change it, they'll have to get additional consents or different consents for those?
Yeah, I think more what I was saying is at subdivision stage, we should be clear that a permitted activity could viably happen, and that might include involving demonstrating earthworks. If the future owner chooses not to do the earthworks in that location, they should get another land use consent, but at least it gives them flexibility.
Right, I understand.
So can I ask a follow-up question? So how broad can a building platform be? I mean, it doesn't just have to be the house site, it could be
Yeah, so
quite...
I'd have to double check on this, but I know in other areas in rural spaces they're 30 by 30, and that is quite a vast building platform, so it really does enable flexibility later. I'll double check on our one though, it might be 15 by 8.
For you, Mr. Chair, can I just ask, I'm trying to find out which hasn't been helpful, just that conversation there around demonstrating a viable subdivision, a viable earthworks platform at the time of subdivision. So we're accepting the Regional Council's submission, and your recommendation is to accept that. However, I think there is a similar recommendation from the Regional Council with regards to the viability of on-site wastewater systems for the allotment size, and we're not accepting that in part at time of subdivision, demonstrating that.
Yeah, I've actually changed my position on that upon further review of the evidence, and we were talking last week via email. They brought up a really good point that we do need that demonstrated at subdivision stage, where you've got to do on-site wastewater treatment.
Okay, perfect. So that does now, we are accepting that in part as your recommendation.
That's
Okay,
correct.
thank you.
Thank you. Just a couple of more questions. In paragraph 135 on page 41, you're recommending to add a note to Rule 2A. I just want to clarify how you see that working, that note. So this is clause 2 of that rule is no new site is created and no existing site area is changed by more than 10% of the original area. And then you're saying if it is more than 10%, it shall be considered under Rule 1A, which is the basic baseline rule for subdivision as a controlled activity. But then where the activity conditions aren't met, the rule says you're a discretionary activity. So I'm just asking how that would work if they're proposing it more than 10%.
What a great point. I probably had overlooked that element. I'd say the discretionary status associated with a boundary adjustment is probably more prevalent to every other standard, not the 10% standard.
Right.
I'd say that when the boundary adjustment is beyond the 10%, it's no longer an adjustment of a boundary. It really is.
I know, that's your
whole new
threshold
lot.
to say it's not a boundary
Yeah.
adjustment anymore.
Yeah, so I think maybe if I could have the opportunity to clarify that discretionary status applies to all the other standards for the controlled rule.
We will hear, no doubt, very shortly about this one, but this is the vexed question about connections to telecommunications. Now, I had a recent objection to conditions around this particular point for a subdivision, not in Napier, somewhere else. So it did raise the whole issue, and their point was that you didn't need to physically connect to telecommunications anymore. It could all be done wirelessly and things. So I suppose the general question is, that because you provide that option for it in standard 16 there, S16. So I'm just thinking out loud, basically, that so an applicant could say that we don't need to hardwire our connection into the telecommunication network. We can just rely on the future property owners just connecting that way.
I would honestly put it on the telecoms provider. It's what they're most comfortable with. I understand in their further evidence that wireless is appropriate in rural areas and urban areas where connections are available for hardwiring, that there should be a connection. I do agree with them. I think that onus needs to be on the developer first and the future landowner. I recommend accepting their modification to standard 16 for utility services. I think their wording is a lot more clear than the wording that I'd proposed.
Okay, we'll bear that in mind when we hear from them shortly. Just on page 74, in relation to standard S1, the minimum allotment sizes. And again, I may not have had enough coffee when I read this, so excuse me if I got this wrong, probably have. There's two elements to this standard. One is where there's no minimum allot size for two situations, A and B, and then there's the other element, which is a minimum allot size of 350 applies to any subdivision that creates new vacant allotments. So if you don't meet that, you flip straight into non-complying activity. Is that correct?
So how I've interpreted this role is that we've actually created a very permissible subdivision pathway, provided you show your bulk and location of your land use on it. And we've got really no minimum lot size for that, so it really encourages well-planned urban environments. Where the developer's unwilling or not in a position to provide that future development, if they can't achieve it 350 metres squared, because that's kind of what we'd consider a viable building, could comply with your bulk and location later. If it's, say, 250 and they're not going to show your land use orientation on it, for sure it should be a non-complying activity. You'd have to have a very good reason to go undersized and then also not show your land use. So I think it demonstrates to plan users, we want you to really think about how you're developing urban areas.
I suppose the question underlying my question was that this also applies to higher density residential zone precincts as well. So what, say there's a proposal that where a vacant lot is created that's, say, 345 square metres, but it would still be a non-complying activity in a high density zone?
Yeah, and I think that's our opportunity to change when we've talked about that minimum lot size for the high density. Maybe we amend this provision for that zone. I think 350 is still appropriate for medium and general res standards, just in terms of what's permissible later in their land use provisions.
thank you. Got one more tab. Again, it's a terminology question. Paragraph 288, page 79. It's an existing term, so it's not anything you're proposing to change, but you say 800 square metres of fully serviced sites, and I'm just thinking, is fully serviced understood by plan users, what fully serviced means?
I think that's a great point, and we could provide a point of clarity there, maybe connected to wastewater, stormwater, and potable.
Yeah, it's just a
Yeah.
general, what does fully serviced mean for allotment
Yeah, for sure.
kind of things. Okay, I have no further questions. Any other points officers want to raise before we move on today? Any other questions from the panel? No. Okay, well, thank you. We will turn to our submitters now. And I'll just, I think it's telecommunication companies, is it correct? Yep. And they're doing it online, so we will get them online.
Kia ora, everybody. Can you guys hear me?
All right, now we can see your faces now, thank you.
Excellent. So I'm Tom Anderson. I'm a planner at Insight and appointed to provide expert evidence on behalf of the telecommunication companies. With me, I have Graham McCarrison from Spark and Andrew Cantor from Chorus. Just to get a quick overview of my evidence, as noted, many of the points raised in the submissions were addressed at the 42A reports. They're either agreed with or the recommendations made within the 42A reports are accepted. And as mentioned by Ms. Mills and questioned by the panel, there's agreement on sub S16, but I think we could provide some further clarification on that matter. But in terms of the outstanding matters between myself and the 42A reports, these are only in regard to earthworks. One is where the earthworks rules in relation to infrastructure are located within the plan. My preference is that they are contained in the infrastructural network utilities chapter, whereas the 42A officer's preference is to retain them in the earthworks chapter, and both of us have the same reason, and that it accords with New Zealand planning standards. Shows that these aren't clear in terms of how those provisions should be provided for. The reason for my preference as well really is about the one-stop shop nature of an infrastructure chapter, and that the planning standards does allow for that to occur. But I take the point that with e-plans and cross-referencing that that is also an appropriate way. So it really is a sort of a horses for courses type, well, not a horses for courses, but a preference type approach. The only other point I'll make there is that it should be consistent in its application. I think if you're an infrastructure chapter and you are considering other district-wide matters, whether it be heritage or Indigenous biodiversity, I think it should be comprehensive in that it should consider all extraneous matters that influence the infrastructure chapter, rather than some are within the infrastructure chapter and some matters are within the earthworks or the Indigenous biodiversity chapter. The other matter raised was concerning earthworks standard 2, and that's regardless of what part of the plan that the earthworks provisions are in. We sought that it be amended to permit trenchless methods for infrastructure installation within 10 metres of a stream or 50 metres of flood protection works. In my view and experience, with the right parameters in place, such works will not have any noticeable effect on streams or flood protection, and therefore can be permitted. And I've put those parameters in my evidence in chief around limiting the size of the opening to do the trenchless works to 1 square metre, with other minor issues. That's the summary of where we are at. If I can hand over to Mr. McCarrison and Mr. Cantor in the first instance, just to briefly talk to our point on subdivision standard 16 around rural and urban areas, and then we can answer questions from there maybe.
Okay, thank you. And just for the record, we have attending yourself, Mr. Anderson, and Mr. McCarrison for Spark, and Mr. Cantor for Chorus. So just for the record, to know who's actually in attendance. So thank you. Mr. Harrison. McCarrison, sorry.
Good morning. So in regard to the query around the need for fibre, so the industry, as in our submissions, puts the provision of fibre without the need for specific new cell sites within urban areas, with a kind of preference that for big new developments, then you'd have some negotiations around that. But that's just a general side thing. And so we don't support not having fibre in those urban areas. And Andrew will talk to you about what Chorus is doing in terms of rolling out further fibre to other communities wider than just urban. But so if there's going to be a reliance on just the mobile networks, or some people might now say, oh, well, we're going to have satellites that are just going to beam down a service, and new people coming to a development or moving out into the rural environment quite often have the same expectation of connectivity in those communities as you do in urban. And currently in urban, through the various programs over the last few years of rolling out ultra-fast broadband, fibre is the core underlying network. The mobile networks have been left to be commercial arrangements, so we pay for our own networks, so One, Two and Spark, to provide network into those communities. In new development areas, that will often mean that unless there's existing mobile network, coverage in a new development area may not have the same experience as in an older area where there's a lot more coverage. In a new area, we're probably going to need a new cell site, less so in some of the sort of growth areas within Napier, basically. I was going to say Napier, Hastings, that whole community we've been looking at spatial planning for it. So that's kind of where it is. So we have accepted that there's a need for people to have access, whether they take it up or not is their choice, but to have fibre. Andrew, do you want to add more to that?
Sure, thanks, Graham. So for Chorus's position is that fibre should be installed alongside other services at the time of subdivision, particularly in those urban areas. People expect to have access to the best telecommunications systems available, and that is fibre. And as we see, it's the preferred technology. Where fibre is available, uptake is sort of edging up close to 80%. And what we're trying to avoid essentially is we've had this situation in parts of the country where if fibre is not installed at the time of subdivision, we then get requests to provide it later on, but it should have happened, alongside those other services when the entire subdivision was being serviced, not on an individual basis, and not with us having to go and dig up brand new sort of footpaths and berms to install it retroactively.
Okay, thank you.
If I can add one thing, please, Mr. Chair. The leave I've sought in my the relief I've sought in my evidence at paragraph 26. I heard you mention earlier that you might have read something when you hadn't had your morning cup of coffee. Well, I might have written something there when I hadn't had my morning cup of coffee. I've confused points 1 and point 2 around fibre and wireless availability for subdivision in any zone creating 100 lots or more. So if I can provide the panel as soon as I can with a rewrite or an amendment to that relief, just so it makes sense in that, and it aligns with what I've written in my evidence in chief in terms of for 100 zones, subdivision for 100 lots or more. That would be appreciated. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That's okay.
Thank you.
Can I just ask a general question before I turn to the panel? I'm just thinking if the subdivider has the option for fibre connection or to rely on Wi-Fi, the network, how does a subdivision consents processing planner know when one would be appropriate and when one wouldn't? Because I can imagine, quite often they'll try and cut down the costs of the whole thing by saying, well, we can rely on Wi-Fi, we don't need connection. So how does the council subdivision consent planner know, can make a judgment call on that?
I think it's very similar to roading or water. You need to know that there is capacity in the network. The difference here is that the provider is being privatised. What hasn't always been that way, but now telecommunications infrastructure has been privatised. There needs to be input seen in an application that proves that there's existing of a mobile or wired network for what the subdivider or the developer is proposing.
Right.
So I think the permitted standard can only be fulfilled with that consultation occurring pre-application.
So it may be as simple as a letter from one of the providers to say, yes, we've got capacity in this area for...
Yes, and with that direction about urban zones or any subdivisions of 100 or more being a big from Chorus. If you're rural and outside of that, then yeah, you're looking at the other wireless providers as well. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Any questions from the panel?
Thank you very much for your submission, Annette speaking. I just have a question around S16, the utility services section, matters for discretion that you're proposing 3, around a notification system around potential future purchases of a subdivision without a connection. I'm just conscious of the practical implication of that at subdivision stage. Have you observed that in any other wording? Is that something you might reconsider the wording of as well?
The intention there is for something to be on the title, just so that any future purchase is abundantly clear. But there could be other methods, so we don't want to limit it solely to that. I don't know what those methods are, but yeah, that's the intention there, just not to limit the scope, how that would occur.
Okay, thank you. That makes more sense.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. Liz here. I think, first of all, thank you for your evidence and being quite clear about what you have accepted from the officer's recommendations, so that's very helpful. I'm also just wanting to ask a question about sub S16 as well, and just in terms of more looking long term, and you may not be able to answer this, but in terms of the longevity of a district plan, are you satisfied that the terminology that we're using here is future-proof?
I might pass over to Mr. McCarrison and Mr. Cantor to answer this question. As far as I know, it is. It's what I'm used to. But
Thank you.
So we've been careful with the use of the words logic to it. So if we were specifying, for example, the current technology that the mobile companies roll out, which is the 4th and now the 5th generation of technology, and not thinking about what will logically come, which is the 6th generation in 2030, then I think we would be limiting it. So it's the general use of wireless, which in the industry would mean mobile, anything that isn't hardwired, so satellite to a cell site principally, and any other form that we haven't thought about. So,
Thank you.
and the use of fibres is just standard, isn't it, Andrew? So.
That's correct. And if I could just add that the sort of, once the fibre network's in the ground, the ongoing performance upgrades and sort of scalability of it is just by tweaking the electronics at either end. So as data demands and who knows whatever's coming in the future down the pipeline in terms of increased capacity needs, that can be easily achieved with the existing fibre network just by tweaking those electronics at either end.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now, one more question for me, Mr. Anderson. In terms of your recommended change to standard 2 for earthworks, so your exception for trenchless methods is only in relation to point 4 of that standard, or is it for all of the standards?
It's only in relation to point 4. The remainder of them are okay.
Right. So point 4 includes being within, well, the exception would be to be within 10 metres of a stream?
10 metres of a stream or 50 metres.
Right. But the only depth control there is in relation to trees, underneath trees. Should there be a depth control in relation to the stream itself? Or proximity to the stream?
I don't think there needs to be one in relation to the depth beneath a stream. In theory, as long as you're beneath the stream with directional drilling or other trenchless methods, if you're crossing that water body, you will need to be beneath it to be able to directionally drill, because you need to be in soil, not above the stream bed. Anything above the stream bed, if that was the option, would require regional consent for a crossing.
That's right. I was just thinking that. Okay, thank you. I have no more questions. Any more questions from the panel? No. Well, thank you very much for your attendance today.
Thank you. We are now off to do the same thing in Gore. Parallel process.
It's colder down there than it is in Napier today. So.
It's nice and warm in my room in Wellington. So
thank you very much.
Hey, thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you. Do we have Kaingora online? We do. Okay. Oh, in person, even better. Thank you. Well, welcome. Sorry you're so far down the track there. Maybe we'll.
No, it's absolutely fine.
Might bring that table up in future, not now, just to come a little bit closer for us. So we'll do that after morning break. So welcome.
Thank you so much.
So we have.
You can attempt my name.
Yep. I'm just trying to get control of everything here. Right. So we have read your pre-circulated statement. Thank you very much for that. So you're welcome to talk to the main points.
Thank you. And just on that note, thank you so much for accepting it. I got my dates wrong, so really appreciate that.
Excuse me, could you just move the microphone closer
Yeah, a little
to
bit
you?
closer.
Thank you.
There you go. Is that better?
Yep.
Yes, great.
Cool. So tēnā koutou katoa, my name is Lizelle Benica, and I hold the position of Principal Development Planner at Kaingora Homes and Communities. I'm authorised to give corporate evidence, although I am a planner with about 16 years' experience. So my primary evidence is summarised basically to the background of our portfolio in Napier and the rationale for the relief sought. I'd like to acknowledge the Section 42A officers and their reports and note that we accept most of the changes, so really there's only a couple of points that we still have in contention, which is great. So just in terms of Kaingora and what we have here in Napier, we have about 1,530 properties at the moment, and then a further 540 households that are on the waiting list currently waiting for a home. So a household could be one person or a family. Our program has basically been a lot of renewals. Marae Nui is one of our bigger areas, but then also we have single sites that we look at where we try and do around a 3-to-1 uplift, which is around removing one home and replacing with 3 normally. Through new national government direction, we are changing that slightly, and we're starting to move through to a renewals program as well as a divestment program as well. So in terms of earthworks,
The only two areas that we have still is just volume and single activity status. So the volume per site. So Kaingaora seeks a more enabling permitted activity framework in relation to earthworks, being a permitted activity threshold of 250 cubes per site to apply in the residential zone and precincts, provided that activities are able to comply with general earthworks standards. Complying with the earthworks standards up to permitted threshold of 250 cubes is an efficient way of addressing the effects associated with such a level of modification. It is an effective way of balancing the management of potential adverse effects with the need to enable development and delivery of housing within residential zones. It's our experience that earthworks activities and the potential adverse effects are typically well understood. So compare that between 50 or 250. The general earthworks standards would apply regardless of whether consent is required for the volume of earthworks. And I did provide a whole set of our resource consents that we have had granted, which basically just reiterate those standards. I do note, though, that our relief sought here does have an interrelationship with what we're seeking in the residential chapter. So we're asking for more, a more permissible standard in terms of the amount of dwellings that you could have on a site as a permitted activity. So that's also where the interrelationship is. I did a little bit of calculations and had a chat to a civils mate of mine as well. And just to put it in terms of practical terms, if you have a site of 1,000 square metres and you're only stripping to 100 millimetres of topsoil for a raft kind of foundation platform, you're looking at already at about 200 cubes, which would set you off on that limit. So 50 cubes is quite limiting. This is also limiting in terms of permitted activities that you could do, and what we, as I mentioned before, in terms of us having to look at renewals and demolition work instead, that 50 cubes does start to, we would be triggering it. So within my evidence, I did say that it's not going to have relatively little practical consequence for larger developments, but will have quite an effect on smaller developments. Smaller developments typically are impacted disproportionately by additional regulatory hurdles, as they often have smaller overall budgets, which are less able to absorb additional unnecessary administrative costs. And then just in terms of the activity status and the difference between the building activity of 100 cubes and then also just the general earthworks of 50 cubes, we find it a bit difficult to understand why there is a difference between the two. I understand that so that through the building consent process you could have some sort of oversight over the earthworks. But just noting as well that this is also, you could have a building activity or any activity that is permitted that could reach that threshold. We often, in terms of what we do, like demolition or renewals, might look at looking at stripping topsoil or the like. So that would also ping us over that threshold. I have in my summary statement, and can provide that too, had a look at a few different thresholds across the motu. So just noting in terms of Tier 2's New Plymouth proposed district plan is probably one of the newer ones that has come out. They're currently going through appeals, but the earthworks section is not under appeal anymore. They have no threshold, but they do have obviously standards as well. That's also quite normal in Tauranga City Council in my rohe. There is no threshold there as well. Porirua City Council, granted it is a Tier 1, they have a 250 cubes threshold. And then we do have Rotorua, which is also new in terms of their plan change. That's a Tier 2, that's 100 cubes per the 12-month. And I can provide that to you. So granted, I do understand that there's so many different standards around the country, so it's quite difficult to come to something solid, I guess. And then moving just on to vacant lot subdivision, I agree with the reporting officer that deferring the lot size to the residential hearings seems appropriate, especially around bulk and location, around height in relation to boundary and height as well. Through my corporate evidence, I have provided the Auckland Unitary Plan example, which has been in practice for quite a while. Cognizant that I don't like to bring Auckland to the regions, but it has been a really good example of how things can work, and we have been able to use that those vacant lots and shape factor requirements easily. So through that, we would support a minimum lot size and a shape factor as well. But yes, agree that it should probably be deferred. I was also looking at the Rotorua and Plan Change 9, because that was also brought up there, so just another one. So the residential 2 area is their high density, and they have 1,400 squares as a minimum. Porirua is about 9 by 14 metre shape factor, and then a minimum of 300 squares for high density residential. I just wanted to turn to the activity status pathway as well, noting that it's a non-compliant activity if you have a vacant lot subdivision that doesn't comply with those minimum standards. Kaingoa is seeking a more enabling restricted discretionary activity pathway. We consider that infringing applications to demonstrate how the proposal would continue to provide for buildings and dwellings that comply with zone development standards through matters of discretion is more helpful. And I just wanted to seek clarity, just when I was listening to the 42A officer speak, she had said that if you are showing a complying land use, then that should be okay. I'm not sure if I read the rule that way. I would assume it was if you had a consent to land use, a bundle consent between sub and land use to be able to provide that. I guess where we're coming from is if you have appropriate assessment criteria and can show a complying or mostly complying land use, like a black box, but you're not applying for a land use at that time, that could be appropriate rather than falling into the non-complying status and having to go through that gateway test, which is quite stringent, we consider. So that's just something to think about. My last point is just around the subdivision guidelines. In practice, the incorporation of design guidance within the district plan creates additional de facto set of rigid rules and standards to be complied with, which fail to recognise or allow flexibility and innovation in design in achieving this. It's within our experience at Kaingoa, the outcomes envisioned by a particular zone or chapter should be clearly laid out in objectives and policies rather than a design guideline. So what we find is if you do have a design guideline within the district plan, that becomes a bit of a tick box exercise and can make resource consents really difficult to achieve because it becomes part of the assessment of quite a rigid assessment criteria. We consider that design guidance is best retained simply as guidance to be relied upon and utilised as a tool outside of the district plan to assist applicants to better understand and interpret the relevant provisions. So yes, again, we just consider that it should be put in as objectives and policies, those key criteria that we'd want to achieve something. We have found that we have struggled in some parts where design guidelines have been popped in as a district plan requirement, especially around, I'll give an example of Palmerston North District Council, where their design guidance has become specifically assessment criteria and quite rigid, and we really struggle with things like where location of windows are and doors, especially around our on-site manufactured homes as well, which can't be changed that easily or interrelationshiply. Yeah. And that's me. Any questions?
Okay, thank you. Can I just clarify, really? You conclude by seeking a permitted activity threshold of 250 cubic metres per site.
Yes.
Now, you do refer in your evidence to that they can be appropriately managed through general earthworks permitted activity standards. Can you just clarify, you're happy with the standards for permitted activities to control all the potential effects of minor or small-scale earthwork?
Yes, that's correct, yeah.
So they're already in the plan now, you're not recommending any additional controls or conditions?
No, the ones that are notified are, yeah, we consider appropriate.
Okay, thank you. And in terms of the minimum shape factor and things, you're okay for it to be deferred upon further deliberations by the reporting officers?
Yes, yeah, definitely. Especially around height in relation to boundary, yards, height. It all really does have a really good interplay with a lot size, especially with high density. We find that how that fits within an envelope and how you can easily have a good quality development in high density residential really does have a big factor to play in terms of that minimum lot size.
Okay, thank you. Any questions from the panel? No? Oh, sorry. Okay, no, all good. So
Cool.
thank you very much for attending in person.
No, thank you
and
so much.
providing
And I'll
evidence.
put these over there.
Much appreciated. Okay, we will take a break. We are 20 minutes overdue. We have Ms. Francis.
She is here, but they're
Out there waiting. Well, we'll take a 20-minute break and resume at 11:10. Hopefully that won't put the schedule too awry. Okay, thank you very much. everybody. The hearing stream 2 hearing is reconvened after morning break. We have Ms. Francis for the Bay Planning Company. Take the stand, as they say. Welcome. We tried to bring it a little bit closer, but there's only so much you can do, so sorry for the long distance.
That's okay, no problem. I can hear you fine.
Thank you. We have your submission in front of us, and I'm guessing it's the part relating to subdivision provisions?
That's correct, yes.
Okay, so
Yes.
we're here to listen to your points. So.
Thank you. Thanks for your time this morning, and good morning, everybody. I apologise, my evidence has not been pre-circulated, and I won't read through it word for word, but I will just quickly start by saying my name is Alison Francis, and I'm the Director of Bay Planning, which is a small planning consultancy based in Hastings here in Hawke's Bay. I hold a Masters of Planning from the University of Auckland, and I'm also a full member of the NZPI. Like I said, I won't go through point by point because there is one particular submission I would like discussion on today. I would like to first of all say that the main point of my submission had been and to do with regards to subdivision, had been to do with the sub S3 minimum lot sizes rural lifestyle zones, and to remove the average requirement from the rural lifestyle zone and to keep the minimum lot size at 5,000 squares. I support Ms Mills's recommendations in her Section 42A report that the minimum average of 1.5 hectares is removed, as well as the requirement to go back to the 11th of November, the year 2000. The main point of my submissions haven't changed, but I'd like to reiterate why I think this is really important. Obviously, that zone does occupy quite a lot of the Western Hills of Napier, and also with the release of the draft future development strategy, we're seeing the councils really grapple with where it is appropriate to have future growth. And I think that the rural lifestyle zone really allows itself to be used efficiently and appropriately for residential growth in close proximity to our urban centres. My further submissions on other submitters, I agree and support Ms Mills in her Section 42A report with the amendment to sub S8 for the definition, changing the definition of flood-free. With regards to the submission that I made for changing part of the rural lifestyle zone that is connected to reticulated water and wastewater to reduce to a minimum of 3,000 square metres. Having read Ms Mills' justifications in the Section 42A report, I concur with her, and I would like to withdraw that further submission. And then I also appreciate that Ms Mills has agreed with the submitter, Ms McFlynn, and myself, just to amend some of the wording around the protection of rural productive land. But drawing your attention to my final point, further submission, not to sound like a robot, 251.189.22. So this was, Ms McFlynn has made a submission requesting that there is a change to the performance standard in sub S8, which requires that the details and the extent and quantum of earthworks required to create a building platform and access is removed. And she said that because in some instances when we do rural subdivisions, there can be more than one appropriate building platform. And you may not know where a person is going to build a house until such time as they've bought the property and they then go and decide that's where they want to locate their house. Ms Mills considered this request and weighed it alongside that of the Regional Council, who opposed the submission. Regional Council requested that this performance standard remain as it considers the scale and location of earthworks are important in assessing the suitability of a proposed building platform. I absolutely agree. You must always make sure that you're assessing the suitability of a building platform. But it did make me wonder about what that performance standard, sub S8, is actually going to ask of applicants when they make a rural subdivision. If they are required to provide the details of the extent and quantum of the earthworks, if that then requires an earthworks consent, does the subdivision consent holder hold that consent? Are they then required to go and put the building platform in? So at the moment, generally, when we do a rural subdivision, unless there is only one place you could ever put the building platform in, and or the applicant is going to put the building platform in, we don't tend to get or have to provide that information up front. And I just worry that if you end up with a consent holder who holds a consent for the subdivision and the land use component being the earthworks, but they then don't actually go and do the earthworks, and they might sell it, there's a bit of a disconnect between who actually is responsible for the installation of the building platform. So I'm not sure with sub S8 what Napier City Council would like the applicant to do. Do they have to sub S8A requires that you show a viable building platform, but sub S8B requires you provide the details of the extent and quantum. And if that then requires a resource consent, who applies for that? So probably that's my main question, is just to plant that seed with the officers to maybe go back and just have a think about how that actually works in practice, who then ends up with the consent for any further earthworks, especially when we're thinking about a property that could have multiple building platforms. It seems like an awful lot of work for something that may never actually happen if someone comes in and chooses a different spot to put their building platform. So I hope that makes sense. Got very technical there, and I thought, no, I just need to make sure that I can. It's one of those ones where it could end up, but just causing some problems in practice once it's been adopted.
Okay, thank you. I would just kickstart questions. So you say oftentimes it will be the new owner of the lot. How often is often, do you think?
Good question. I don't know. I just feel like in my experience when we've had applicants do rural subdivision, they do have to identify where a building platform will be, but they don't either have to provide any further information than that unless through geotechnical investigation it's determined that we absolutely know that there would need to be a resource consent for earthworks. And that could normally be to do with slope, say it's too steep. It feels like it's requesting them to provide a lot of information when it may not be them that actually goes and does the work. And so it's just that understanding about who's actually responsible for undertaking the earthworks. Is it that Napier want the building platform to be created prior to 224C being granted? And if that's the case, then that's fine. I think it just needs to be made really clear in the wording that the building platform has to have been formed and signed off by an engineer prior to the completion of the subdivision. If that's not the case, then I think it's maybe just understanding how the officers at Napier will handle that. If I come in with an applicant and we've got 4 viable building platforms, do we have to show earthworks extent and quantum for each of those 4 viable building platforms, or just one? And which one do we choose?
Thank you. Because clearly, I mean, you know that the consent runs with the title. Whoever owns the title at the time is responsible, whatever. But I see your point about the Section 223 issue, so hopefully that matter will be addressed by the officers. I don't think I have any questions. Any questions from the panel?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Ms. Francis. I've also got a question really around the building platform. So if you look at sub S8, number one is reasonably clear. Well, from my perspective, it's identifying a building platform that's obviously not going to get flooded. In a nutshell. I think your issue then is around number 2, which is the detail must be provided of the extent and quantum of earthworks. We also have listed in the matters of discretion earthworks. It is one potential solution maybe to look at the extent and quantum, not necessarily the detail, as part of the matter of discretion rather than being one of the conditions and standards?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's no issue with being asked to provide detail around how much earthworks would be required. And I think too, where does access come into this? So if vehicle access has to be provided as well to get to the building platform, is that looked as part of the extent and quantum of the building platform, or is that separate again? I think that it absolutely is appropriate to be a matter of discretion. Certainly no issue with providing that information if asked and to talk about it. I think it's more just, my concern was you may end up providing or granting a resource consent that includes consent for earthworks for something that may not happen.
Yep.
And it's just that, again, it's this unintended consequences around people may feel like they've had to do work that didn't end up needing to be done at that time.
Thank you.
No, I'm clear, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for your
attending
time and for all the work. I really appreciate it, and I wish you all the best, and I'll see you next year at another hearing, I'm sure.
No doubt.
Thank you. See you.
Ms. Rouse. So our next submitter is Heritage New Zealand Pohere Taonga, and I think Mr. Raymond is online. No, he's not. If he is unavailable, are our next submitters available to come on board? We will just pause for a moment while we just try and sort things out. Coming up to the table, Mr. Raymond can wait. So we have Ms. Nicholson and Mr. Meredith? No? All right, Mr. Meredith, sorry. Oh, and then another person.
Kia ora koutou. Ko Nicola Nicholson Takuingoa. I am the manager at Hawke's Bay Regional Council in the Policy and Planning team. I've got Shelley King to my left, who is a policy planner in my team, and I've got Dale Meredith at the end, who is a senior policy planner in my team. Thank you for the opportunity to present today. I'll pass over to Dale to give us a bit of a summary, and then we can happy to take any questions.
Cool.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the report which was prepared by the City Council. It's very comprehensive. So we're really only just wanting to focus on a couple of points where we vary and would like to have some modification made. The first is in relation to the responsibilities in the coastal environment, and I think that's just a simple correction. Where our regional coastal environment plan does actually cover not just the coastal marine area, it also goes into the landward extent of the coastal environment. So there is some overlap between the district plan and the relevant regional plan. And figure 1 on page 7 of the information that we provided for you, I think illustrates where that overlap occurs, where the areas that the regional coastal environment plan include hazard provisions, which are on the landward side. They are marked in pink on the map, and the blue area is where the district council's district plan would take on full RMA responsibility for land uses. The next point that we wish to highlight is in relation to earthworks in the coastal environment. For the Regional Council, our main interest is in relation to natural hazards, natural hazard management, and looking to get some alignment between the regional provisions and the district plan provisions. And to that extent, we were uncomfortable with the proposed permitted rules in terms of quantities of material that could be taken or deposited. Because our interest is in hazard management, we thought the main aspect of that work should be managed through the yet to be notified natural hazards section. But in the meantime, there are parts of the coastal environment where people want to just go and take a few rocks for their back garden, what have you. And so we thought it was appropriate to include a permitted rule for small quantities of material to be taken, which aligns with what's in the Regional Coastal Environment Plan, and we think that the impacts of that small level of taking would be pretty minor. Continuing on in the natural hazards space, looking at the flood-free building platform under sub S8, so we're now on page 10. We're more than happy with having a building platform identified, but we do think that there is a need to identify an additional freeboard allowance for where there are habitable spaces. Doesn't necessarily belong in the subdivision chapter, it doesn't easily fit there, it may fit in the natural hazards chapter, but we've suggested some wording for wherever that lands. Our next concern in terms of subdivision is in relation to wastewater services for those rural sections, large lot sections, which are not to be reticulated through the City Council's wastewater systems. And we noted that there have been some recommendations through the officer's report to standardise some allotment sizes down to 5,000 square metres. No particular problem with that, as long as we can be certain that wastewater can be adequately provided for on site. And to that end, we've given a couple of examples, 3 examples, where our consenting staff have had some significant issues trying to land an on-site wastewater system that would work for that particular allotment. One of those was actually double the size of what would be the new 5,000 square metre minimum. And so to that end, we think that when the subdivision proposal is made, that in addition to a building platform, there should be identification of where an on-site wastewater field is to be located. And we have put in some details in our proposed sub S15 wastewater rule, identifying what we think might be appropriate. And if the allotment is able to provide more than one building platform, that's not a problem. What we want to be comfortable is that there is space to service any allotment. The main thing there, I think, is in the discretion, is adding an additional discretion in relation to allotment size, so that it is if it is tight, it is possible to make sure that more land is provided. Our final comment is in relation to subdivision of highly productive land, and we think that the small correction is to recognise the exemptions provided for in the NPS HPL, which we've accidentally incorrectly referenced in the proposed wording change. So if that correction could be made, it's the NPS HPL, not the NPS FM. And that's to include the reference to section 3.10. And those are the additional comments we'd like to make. So happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I'm glad you picked up the point about the freeboard kind of thing. In another recent district plan hearings I was involved with, the whole freeboard was a natural hazards rule or standard, because for a subdivision you'd have to impose that by way of a condition of consent. You could do it through the subdivision things, not as a standard on the subdivision as such. So thank you for your advice there. Thank you for those maps too. I was going to just ask you, just if you don't mind, I know you did cover up what the pinks and the blues were before, but would you mind just sort of specifically pointing to these elements, just describe the plans, what they're showing?
So on page 11, the first site.
We're talking about page 7. The
Page
coastal
seven.
or?
Oh,
Page 7 on the
yeah,
statement.
page 7.
Yeah,
Oh, sorry.
the 4 maps or copies.
Do you want to cover that off, Shelley?
I will try to cover that off. So on all 4 of those maps, the purple zone is, sorry, can you hear me correctly?
Yeah.
Is part of the coastal environment, but we do not have any rules covering those zones for earthworks in our regional coastal environment plan. So they would be areas that I would expect that this rule applies to. However, where we've got the pink zones, and in the top right picture, there's also a hashed out area. These are where we've got renourishment schemes with rules associated to them, and extraction areas, as well as hazard overlays. So they're areas that across the mean high water springs, above and below, we have interest in, and we've got rules relating to all those. So yeah, it's just sort of trying to highlight where our coastal environment rules currently sit, and just in regards to that coastal margin area. The rest of the coastal margin, our rules don't sit. And yeah, I guess we're seeking that aligns, and that it aligns in with our hazards management.
Can I just ask, you might have heard me earlier today ask about the renourishment scheme. What occurs in the renourishment? And I presume it's still an active program, is it?
Yeah, so that is it's done under a consent. So the renourishment scheme consists of an area where gravel can be extracted from at the parade extraction area, and then can be used to deposit at West Shore for basically re-nourishment of that beach. So we're taking from one beach below the marina
Right.
and taking it above. So that runs on a consent basis. Yeah, kind of is the guts of it.
And that's just for the West Shore? There's no other re-nourishment
There
programs?
is, it is for re-nourishment, it's just West Shore
Right.
at this stage.
So the two bottom diagrams there with the pink running along the coastline, there's no gravel extraction there for re-nourishment, right?
So the bottom left-hand diagram at the top, there is a short area, that's where the re-nourishment area is taken from, that's the parade gravel.
Okay, in the hashed line area.
Yep, at the top arrow. And on the bottom right, there is the Awatoto gravel extraction area, which is kind of a legacy area. We haven't been extracting from there for a while, from my best of knowledge.
Okay, thank you, that's helpful. For an out-of-towner, thank you. I might just hand over to the panel, see if there's any other questions for you.
Thank you. Good morning. You were sitting here, I know, a bit earlier when Ms Francis was giving her evidence, and we were having a discussion about the identification of building platforms under sub S8, I think it was. I just had a battle to try and find it again. Just in relation to your proposed changes around sub S15 wastewater, I'm just wondering if there's any value in actually including the identification of an on-site wastewater field in sub S8 as well.
I think support that.
Yeah, maybe that's something to have maybe that's something for the officers too to have a think about.
I think it's, I mean, we'd support making sure that it's covered adequately. I think we'd be deferring to the council in terms of making sure that their rules cover appropriately without duplicating.
Cool, yeah, because I just sort of, you're right, making sure it's covered is the first priority. But I just sort of think in terms of the direction of S8 around the identification of suitable building platform, that kind of sits, the identification of an on-site wastewater disposal field or system site fits probably with that.
Because you can make the argument of why would you identify a building platform site if you can't locate a wastewater field
right.
within that property anyway,
Exactly.
so there's kind of, it becomes redundant.
Yep.
So we'd be comfortable with that.
Yeah, we would support that.
Thank you. No further questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, ladies, for the submission. I had a similar question around sub S15 and your proposed wording in 3 there. I was just thinking around the practicality of that, and so in regards to demonstrating the suitability of a wastewater treatment field, there's sort of a risk with the current proposed wording that the NCC team in determining a subdivision would then be making a determination on the suitability of a wastewater field, which, as you've demonstrated in your submission, can be quite site-specific and tricky. Essentially, they need to demonstrate compliance with Rule 37 in your RRMP, which you've sort of tried to summarise, I guess, in terms of A through D. But I can see lots of scenarios where they might satisfy an NCC planner through a subdivision, but then the practicality of the implementation of an on-site wastewater system might not comply with all of the additional aspects contained within your rule framework, and we may end up in a situation where you still don't sort of achieve what we're setting out to achieve. And I'm just uncomfortable, I guess, unless it's the only foolproof way in my mind is that they demonstrate compliance with the RRMP at the time, Rule 37, a new wastewater system, which avoids us duplicating in our rule.
Well,
Yeah.
I think that the challenge for us is that our consents people are picking up allotments where a consent is required for wastewater. And I think condition E, which we've suggested, which is the work is prepared by a suitably qualified and experienced wastewater installer, could possibly cover that off. Otherwise, we would be, I think, happy to talk further to try and land this rules securely.
Yeah, thank you. I just wonder if that's something where you and the staff could work together potentially on the wording of that, which gets us closer towards, like you say, I think E gives you a level of certainty, but sometimes your installers aren't as familiar as well with your rule framework as what you'd like them to be. So there's sort of no planning oversight, I guess, other than NCC, which aren't in the business of consenting wastewater systems, but we're pulling it in. So, yeah, perhaps if I can just flag, I think there could be a little bit more work there to cover off those loopholes, and if you could work together to do that.
More than happy to do that.
Thank you.
Okay, just one final minor question on that same point, on that standard S15. D talks about a standard 3-bedroom dwelling for calculating loading. Is that a commonly understood term in the wastewater business? What a standard 3-bedroom dwelling would be? What's a non-standard 3-bedroom?
I think the point that was being made is that the wastewater field should be suitable for a residential house of a typical size. We can work out the details of that.
Average 3-bedroom.
Yeah, an average, just a...
We have had instances where there have been fields put in that were well under capacity for the property that was put in, so that's just what that's trying to work on.
Okay, right. Just being pedantic, sorry. Thank you. Any other further questions from the panel? No? Well, thank you very much for attending in person and answering our questions. Much appreciated that, and no doubt we'll be seeing you again sometime in the future.
Of course. Look forward to it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I do understand Mr. Raymond is online, so he could be put through. Sorry about that, Mr. Raymond, for that.
No. Kia ora koutou. First, can you hear me okay?
Yes, and we have your pre-circulated evidence as well.
Thank you.
So,
I think there was some technical issue. I could not get on through my computer, so I managed to do it on the phone. So anyway, whichever way works, we have to work with these things. So
okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and panel. You have evidence, as you mentioned. I don't intend to speak very much about it, but of course, if there are questions, I'll just touch on the subdivision chapter. There's a recommendation for an additional policy addressing heritage places. On the contrary, there was a recommendation on objective 08 is to not amend it. My point in paragraphs 9 and 10 is aiming towards more of a consistent objective, which does flow down into policy, especially with the new recommended policy. Simply to say that the objectives cover overlay precincts and other sites that would be consistent policy and rules also. Apart from that, coastal environment, I touch on earthworks, mentioned the 42A order said submitted did not provide details of rules. My understanding was the submission was focused on Rule 1. And regarding that, I accept the recommendation to that submission. Moving on to signs, again, I think I don't have anything to add apart from what has been recommended, and there's nothing intention of that chapter. But of course, any comments or questions?
Okay, thank you, Mr. Raymond. Just in terms of your paragraph 9 and 10, so you're still seeking to have that term and sites containing historic heritage items included in Objective 8 for subdivision? Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Thank you. I don't think I have any further questions for the panel. No?
No.
Right. All that for one simple question. Thank you, Mr. Raymond.
That's great. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Next submitter. Sorry, I'm just getting my schedule in front of me. Surveying the Bay. So, Mr. Bankhurst, we've got your presentation, which... Are we showing your presentation this morning? Oh, we are. Great. Fantastic. So I don't have to bring it up. It has been pre-circulated, but we're happy to have you lead us through the presentation. And
Sure.
You should have a clicker or something to help you, or someone under your
yes,
control.
I do. Yep.
Okay, see if it works.
Yep.
Yes, there you go.
All right, good morning, everyone. I'm a local surveying and land development consultant. So I guess I'm really an end user of the district plan, and my submissions points really came about through, I guess, current irritations I have with the operative district plan and how they flow through into the proposed district plan. So really, my points are quite practical points. So what I might do, I've got up on that slide a summary of my submission points, and there's 3 of them there that are sort of greyed out or a darker colour. They're ones where the Section 42A report effectively agreed with the submission on allotment sizes in the rural zone, building platforms defining the flood-free area. So I'm not going to talk to those points, but I will talk to the others. So the first one is related to the cross-lease to freehold subdivision, which we don't do a lot of, and I think partly because of the difficulty with the consenting requirements and the cost to do the conversion. But I was pleased to see the reporting officer agree that as we currently have to do quite a detailed assessment of pretty much all the subdivision matters if we're doing a conversion presently, but I think the reporting officer agreed that that's just not really needed and agreed to eliminate most of those standards apart from the one on stormwater. But I still have a problem with that because there is no land development in a conversion. The pre and post development stormwater runoff is exactly the same. So what exactly are we doing in an assessment of stormwater for a cross-lease freehold conversion? There's nothing really to assess in my view. So I would similarly like that to be dropped from the assessment as well. So really what you're getting down to is ensuring that the boundaries and the easements created by the consent and the proposal are appropriate and they reflect the existing cross-lease environment. There really shouldn't really need to be any physical matters, although the engineers always want the water supplies separated, and that's something we can't really avoid. But again, that actually creates an issue for some cross-lease conversions because it's just too expensive to create separate connections. But I accept that that's something that's probably going to continue because the engineers will insist on that as it's part of their engineering code. The next point I made was quite a simple one about vehicle crossings and the potential to defer them till after subdivision stage. Section 42A report felt that this could be addressed as a sort of case-by-case basis, and I agree. However, every time I've lodged an application for consent saying we'd like to defer the vehicle crossing till a later date and have a consent notice covering it, it just gets ignored or rejected by the council planning officers. Therefore, we get to a stage where we're getting 224C and we're having to sort of negotiate with the roading engineer saying, look, these are the reasons we want to defer, and they may or may not agree. Surely we can have a more efficient process than that, and allow consent notice in only certain situations that warrant it. And also, just on another issue that wasn't part of my submission, but I thought I could mention if I may, is that in Standard 12 on page 50 of the Section 42A report, the standard says that all allotments shall be provided with vehicle access. Now, just as an aside, I've just mentioned that we've done several applications recently where there is no vehicle access, there's pedestrian access only, to enable more efficient use of the land and to create more affordable dwellings. So perhaps that could be looked at by council officers to allow a little bit of flexibility in that sort of situation rather than kicking it out into another category. The submission points I made about utility services, thankfully the Section 42A report agreed that in rural subdivisions, a physical electricity connection shouldn't need to be provided. This has created quite a headache in the past in the rural zones of Napier, where perhaps you're not even creating a site that is for land development, maybe restructuring an orchard or something like that, and this requirement kicks in and it just creates quite a hassle. But I accept that electricity infrastructure is required in an urban area. My comment about telecommunications, I didn't really clarify in my submission, but it was really more related to urban infill subdivision rather than sort of large greenfield lots, where I accept on large greenfield lots, putting in fibre infrastructure is a good idea. Although there is still, for those situations, there's still the option for wireless and satellite communications. But in urban infill, your reticulation is already in the street, and yet council forces us to establish a physical connection with extra cost that may not be even needed or used in the future. Why not just leave that to the purchaser of a lot, and they can actually make their own decision and pay for the cost if they want it installed. So that's really where I was coming from, and I know it's caused quite a bit of discussion amongst the telecommunications companies, and I did listen to their submission this morning too, and it seems like they do agree that wireless is a viable option. So anyway, that was just my take on things. Lastly, I had quite a bit of an issue with the standard one for minimum allotment sizes in the residential area, where effectively you can't create a vacant site that is less than 350 square metres unless it is 350 square metres, and presumably what will now become net site area. Well, there was a little bit of discussion about that, what is an allotment, but assuming it goes to a net site area, it's going to be very difficult to do a lot of infill subdivision, particularly in Napier. And I just did a sort of a random summary of 15 infill subdivisions I've done in the last 2 or 3 years, and of those, 11 of them had net site areas less than 350 square metres for either the lot with the existing dwelling or the vacant lot. So both of those will get kicked into non-complying. Well, sorry, correct me, I might be wrong on that. Is with the lot that's with the existing house, you could that would not, if that was less than 350, it wouldn't get kicked into non-complying, would it, Connie? Sorry.
You're correct, if you demonstrate your zone
Yep.
compliance.
So it's only if the vacant lot is less than 350. Right. So of those 15, 9 had, so 60% of them actually had vacant lots that were less than 350. So you immediately kicked into non-complying. There's a whole lot more assessment. There's a whole, it's just, I think it's just a blunt instrument. And I think that could be better managed, even as a discretionary activity with some assessment matters would be my preference. Another point I did make in my submission was that in a state, the standard as written doesn't contemplate staged subdivision, where you always create a vacant lot in the initial stages. And presumably the standard expects that all those lots will have land use consent associated with them, and I understand that that's the ideal scenario, but when you've got small lot subdivisions, often that's just not the case. You just don't go to that level of detail of having a building known. So I guess where I'm coming to is I'm not really comfortable with that 350 square metres, which is why I suggested in my submission that it's actually reduced to 300. But I don't think the planning officers really like that idea. But as an alternative, maybe some other activity status for those, even if it only applied to infill subdivision as opposed to greenfields. Perhaps that could be looked at. And that's me. Happy to take questions.
Okay, thank you very much. I think you sort of answered the question I had of you, when is too small, in terms of that. So you're thinking 300 is a sort of an appropriate sort of too small kind of allotment size?
I've got no real specific justification for that, but we do quite often do sites of around that size.
Right.
Net site area. So of course, if it's a rear site, your total allotment size can be bigger than that anyway. But I mean, for the same reason, I haven't seen any justification for why 350 square metres is taken as a value. It just seems to have been adopted by everyone, but things change over time, and maybe it's just too big a site anyway.
And those examples where you gave, 9 examples did you give? Can you remember roughly what their sizes were?
Sort of about 320 to 345 square metres is quite typical. There might have been one below 300.
Questions from the panel?
Thank you. Just one really around the transport access and connectivity comment there. You talked to us about the fact that you're now designing some lots with just pedestrian access. I was wondering how that then meets the requirements for emergency vehicles to get to a fire engine to get right up close or something like that. Can you sort of paint a little bit of a picture about what those lots might look like and how close they would be to vehicular access options?
Yeah, these examples have been effectively infill sites. So they've been a standard sort of 800 to 1,000 square metre site that's been subdivided into, 4 or 5, 6 allotments. So they're all close to the road reserve. So a fire truck wouldn't go down, even if there was a driveway, standard driveway, fire truck wouldn't go down. They just put the hoses down there. One issue I think is that we need to make sure that we have enough suitable access for ambulance and medical emergencies. So that needs to be thought about. But yeah, that's the scenario.
The issue around stormwater and cross-lease and freehold, I've just been just trying to figure out quite what's going on, because yeah, I accept that just a straight subdivision does not have any potential or any impact, physical effect on what's happening on the site. So I'm just, I guess, trying to get some kind of idea from maybe even from the officers about, what was the rationale then for including sub 13 as part of that requirement?
Yeah, so we talked about this option with our development engineering team, and we've obviously got a significant problem with stormwater in Napier, and subdivision is the opportunity to manage.
So is what you're saying is that when a cross lease is being subdivided and freehold titles are being issued, that's the opportunity to require improvements on a site?
So a little bit of that, so that's kind of the retrofitting opportunity, and we talked about whether the district plan is the appropriate one or bylaws as well. We realise there's multiple ways of cutting this. But then when putting that to one side, when you go from a cross lease to a fee simple, sometimes you kind of create more clear delineated spaces that may incentivise more impervious surfaces. And yes, it's an opportunity to look at that further when you're changing the ownership operation.
So is there potentially a way to make it less onerous if there's just a very straightforward, cross lease to freehold subdivision? Maybe it's something to think about and to discuss.
I'll hold that point and look into it. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Commissioner Brosnan?
Yeah, no, I have the same sort of line of thinking around the infrastructure requirements for the stormwater. So I'm interested in seeing what staff come up with. Thank you.
Okay, and I was going to ask a question on the same point as well. And we are accepting that we haven't yet heard the provisions or submissions on provisions on stormwater yet, next year sometime. So we may have an opportunity to revisit this point, Mr. Pankhurst. So thank you for that. I would sort of indicate that I would have thought that the council is trying to encourage cross-lease conversions to freehold title, given some of the issues with cross-leases historically. So that's another little factor probably to put into the mix. I did have one question, vehicle access, and I'm interested in this. So just more understanding the issue. So you're saying you are completing urban subdivisions now with pedestrian access only, which is likely to become more common. Can you just sort of elucidate that on the examples you're referring to? So these are sort of infill kind of developments?
Yes. Yep.
And with no vehicle access being provided?
No. As per this has only come about through the National Policy Statement on Urban Design.
In terms of parking?
Yes.
No parking.
And I think initially, possibly, council were quite resistant to it, the idea. But I've been working with a developer who is of the view that to solve the housing crisis, we need to have, we need to intensify in town. Mm-hmm. And in sites that are appropriate, so they're close to amenities, perhaps a suburban shopping centre within walking distance, there's enough on-street parking for visitors and people to be able to park, that using up a lot of the site with vehicle, driveways, turning, parking, is in some cases not a good solution. And it also has more stormwater runoff, of course. So whereas, roof water runoff, you can actually easily attenuate into a tank and have less effect. So, it has a lot of benefits. And that's the path that, in some cases, I think is appropriate. But council, I think, are perhaps now more amenable to the idea. But obviously there are certain criteria you need to fulfil.
Would you do us the favour of actually providing an example of this sort of
Sure.
development to us?
Yes.
I'd be interested. How does things like emergency fire, access occur in those sort of situations?
Well, I mean, it's actually there's a lot of infill subdivision where a fire truck can't get down the driveway anyway, so they sit on the road and they run their hoses down, and it's no different in this sort of situation. I can't provide you a built example because these are quite fresh consents, but I can provide one for sure.
Okay, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Yep.
Any further questions for Mr. Pankers? No? Okay, thank you very much for your presentation, Mr. Pankers. We now have the surveying company, if you would like to have a seat at the table. So we have Helen O'Shaughnessy and Network. Familiar faces?
Been
Hello.
done that. Yep.
We do have your pre-circulated evidence, Ms. O'Shaughnessy, and I understand that there was an absence of your track changes recommendations, which has been circulated
Yes.
yesterday, I think, or today.
Yes. You should have received those this morning, Mr. Chair.
We just opened them in front of us. Right. Is that in front of you? Oh, that's right. Okay. Buried mine, I think. Oh, no, there it is. Unburied. Well, welcome. We have read your pre-circulated evidence, but you're more than welcome to talk to the main points in your submission.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning. Kia ora to the panel, members of the panel. We would like to take our evidence as read and our approach. I'd like initially to introduce Nick Wakefield, who is the owner and director of the surveying company, which is a local consultancy with interest right across the region. And Nick will be contributing with some examples today of the points that we'd like to raise. And our approach this morning is very much just to provide some general background and examples of the matters that we have raised in our evidence. And that really focuses on one matter from the standards table and two from the rules table. And just to provide a bit of context at this stage, the recommendations in the Section 42A report were to decline all of the suggestions that have come from our submission. So that's what we're going to be focusing on this morning. Turning to the standards table in S1, which is the minimum lot size in the large lot residential zone and the need for an averaging of 3,000 square metres with a minimum of 1,000 square metres. Our submission was that the requirement for the averaging of 3,000 square metres there is extremely difficult and hard for a lot of property owners to achieve. In some situations, the average lot size falls well below the 3,000 square metres that the zone is trying to achieve, increasing that complexity and challenge of trying to achieve that required density. Our experience also includes landowners who, although they may have been able to comply with the minimum lot size of 1,000 square metres, cannot comply with the averaging provisions of 3,000 square metres, which kicks the activity status from controlled into non-complying. And having clients in this situation, that represents quite a daunting and more cost-effective process in terms of a consenting pathway with regard to both preparing the AEE and the uncertainty of the outcome. We also feel that with the not so recent provisions now around highly productive land, the development of the terrain in the large lot residential zone is possibly more suited and more appropriate to a higher density, given that it has a certain, it's not productive, it doesn't fall within the land use capability classes 1 to 3 generally. Also noting that it's reasonably resilient in terms of natural hazards, and the more recent experience of Cyclone Gabriel is relevant there. We also note that predominantly the large lot residential zone tends to be serviced with Three Waters, which tends to argue that it could achieve an appropriate lower density. The peri-urban character of one detached dwelling in a landscape setting on sites of greater than provided for in the general residential zone, we believe can still be achieved on a 1,000 square metre lot, retaining the open space and landscaping amenity of the large lot residential zone. Finally, we consider that the 3,000 square metre average sizing will effectively prevent the effective use of land in this zone. A predictable outcome will be a number of 1,000 square metre lots with a large balanced property to compensate and comply with the averaging requirements. We feel that subdividers should be able to rely on a minimum lot size of 1,000 square metres to achieve the sought after density in terms of protecting amenity and character of the area. We note that the Section 42A report has recommended that the averaging requirements of 1.5 hectares using the parent allotment as at 11th of November 2000 has been recommended to be removed, and we fully congratulate and support the reporting officer in that regard. And our submission is that if the average allotment sizes can be removed from the rural residential zone, then surely that can be run as a parallel example in the large lot residential zone. And I know that Nick would like to add some more detail to this matter.
So as part of our research between me and Helen around why we've come to this conclusion, part of it was just to do a simple analysis of the area itself. The large lot residential zone has on around about 80 to 90 residential allotments within this zone, and a quick check of the current lot sizing in the area has found that of that only 8 sites can be subdivided under your current rule structure. So an area that's supposedly an area for urban use, and yes, we accept there are some amenity provisions and the like, but it's well serviced. It's, as Alan has already pointed out, generally free of hazards. Yes, there will be some geotechnical requirements given some of the slopes and the rest, but that can all be dealt with within as our feeling is it could be dealt with more effectively through our minimum lot size, which would then open up more opportunities for that area to be intensified slightly. We're not asking for carte blanche and getting down to 500 or less. We're talking about 1,000 square metre sections. In our experience, those are still fairly sparsely populated or dense, or sparsely dense in terms of density. And to have a zone that's supposedly meant to support residential fulfilment and use, only having 8 total properties that can be subdivided, in my mind, doesn't achieve some of the outcomes that you're looking to do through your policy framework. And so we just ask that you maybe just take a wee look at the appropriateness of the averaging requirement. That's my bit there, Helen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to move on now to our second point, which is in regard to sub R12, which are the subdivision provisions relating to highly productive land. Our submission is that the district plan should include some capacity or some allowance to provide landowners with the opportunity of sites identified as LUC classes 1, 2 or 3 by the Land Resource Inventory to be able to undertake independent soils mapping on a property scale by a suitably qualified expert to verify if the land is actually being correctly identified by the Land Resource Inventory. We feel that at this stage, these provisions would only really need to be current in the plan until the transitional definition of highly productive land has been addressed by the Regional Council and it's had an opportunity to do regional mapping. I think that, not to speak on behalf of the Regional Council, but I think that that's still a little bit uncertain in terms of timeframes and whether in fact that regional mapping will be undertaken. Going back to the New Zealand Land Resource Inventory, we totally agree that it's a powerful tool and that it provides consistent coverage across the entire country at a nominal scale of 1 to 50,000. It is generally agreed, though, that the scale is too coarse to use for on-farm planning activities, and for a finer resolution of soil and land resource data at a paddock scale mapping could be an appropriate mechanism. In our experience, the suitability of applying the Land Resource Inventory mapped at a basis of as a final determination for land, whether land is suitable for subdivision is absolutely uncertain. We have had a number of circumstances where we have undertaken individual paddock scale mapping, generally at 1 to 7,000, which has changed the level of, or changed the mapping that's been provided through the LRI, making the land suitable and accessible for subdivision. We'd like to share 2 of those examples with the panel this morning. Both of these are located in the Central Hawke's Bay district, and one concerns, the first example concerns a 3.18 hectare property which is located between Waipawa and Waipukurau. It's predominantly described as flat with some minor slopes, and it was mapped by the LRI as classes, land use capability classes 2 and 3. We had, as I said, we had an individual paddock scale mapping exercise conducted on it, and it showed that there was a reduction in the class 3 land map, and it also introduced 61% of LUC class 4 land, which had not previously been mapped. The paddock assessment also showed that the class 3 land had dense subsoils that limit drainage, known as winter wet and summer dry, with unavoidable and permanent limitations. The paddock scale mapping also showed that the land use capability class 3 land had severe limitations in terms of erosion and wetness when cultivated. The second example we'd like to share with the panel this morning is also located in Central Hawke's Bay in proximity to the coastal settlement of Blackhead. A property there was proposed to be subdivided for a rural lifestyle site around an existing dwelling, and it was mapped in the LRI as being class 3. Paddock scale mapping, however, revealed and confirmed that the LUC class was in fact class 6 due to underlying slope and rock type, which was described as steep and located on mudstone country. I think Nick would like to add some further detail around this point.
So in both instances, because of the course mapping at the NZ, the land resource scale, it became apparent that we needed to go back and get better testing because of, one, the information that was provided to us by the client. They know their land. They well understood that what was actually there was not what was correctly mapped. And that's been, I suppose, from my position being a consultant trying to communicate with people, is that where it is clear that it's great having this tool available that shows us on a regional scale where our best soil should be protected. It makes it very frustrating for a landowner when the coarseness of that mapping, and is it extremely coarse, like we can get areas, as Helen's just explained there, land that was categorised class 2 is actually class 4, land that is categorised class 3 is actually class 6. I mean, that's quite a huge distinction, particularly when it applies to what should be reasonably straightforward subdivisions, the example being around an existing dwelling, and because of a hazard provision, i.e. there was potential flooding on a paddock that was, nowhere near the site, but because of that distinction, it puts us into that realm of having to deal with the NPS HPL. Those sorts of things. So having that ability to have that actually conferred back and say, no, that the mapping, while yes, we understand that we need to address it, there needs to be a way of saying, well, look, actually, the land resource mapping is okay, but it can't be the be-all and end-all, because clearly on lots of occasions it's actually incorrect. And so that's just basically where we sit, that's the frustration, is that yes, we use it as a testing tool, but then if you've got the expert evidence that tells you otherwise, then we would like to think that council would be able to say to, I know the NPS HPL is a extremely difficult piece of work to work through. It's just, it's a frustration from our point of view. And if there's a way that could be mitigated, then we'd like council to explore it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just turning now to our third and final point, which is based on sub R4, subdivision provisions to create conservation lots for the protection of heritage items, archaeological sites and/or sites of significance to Māori. Our submission was that this rule should include the provision for the creation of a conservation lot around protection of Indigenous biodiversity, flora and fauna. There is currently, in our understanding, no rule in the proposed district plan that provides for a conservation lot to protect areas of significant Indigenous flora and fauna, and we think that there is a place for that in the subdivision section. Once again, we have an example to share, and this is similarly based in central Hawke's Bay on the shores of Lake Whātuma, where earlier this year a subdivision of a lifestyle site in the rural production zone created 2.5 hectares of permanently protected in perpetuity land, which was described as having significant natural biodiversity values. It in fact forms part of the riparian margin of the lake, and it was protected in perpetuity through the creation of a conservation lot and a conservation area. The applicant is still at the point of deciding which particular mechanism they will use to protect the conservation lot. The four options are Ngā Whenua Rauhui, which I understand from talking to Nick this morning is possibly what they will choose. The other options for permanent protection are QE2, National Trust, the Department of Conservation covenants, and a local authority covenant. So that's been a very successful example of protecting natural biodiversity values in association with the creation of a lifestyle site.
So what that enabled was that the conservation covenant was able to then sell a surplus dwelling, and that dwelling was then able to fund things like fencing, pest control eradication, spraying, those sorts of things. Speaking on a more broad term, our company, the surveying company, has other offices located in Pukekohe and in Wellington, and particularly in the Pukekohe area, they have been part of a very successful scheme there where they have created over 100 conservation covenant blocks in the association with creating lifestyle lots. The reason for that is, was understood quite significantly. There were certain areas on people's properties that were suitable for development and others that were more suitable to be retired and allowed to develop these areas of bush. And that's run really successfully up there. And the thing with that is that by being able to generate revenue through the sale of land, they've been able to fence and keep these conservation covenants in good working order. In the Pukekohe case, that was a local authority-driven covenant. We are also party to and have done over 200 QE2 covenants in the time that I've been involved with the surveying company. And we still continually do lots of them. They're a big part of what we see, and often it has been, generally they've been driven not from the need to create lifestyle lots, but we know that funding of the QE2 Trust is not at the levels that it used to be, and so their ability to then go and offer farmers the ability to, or not just farmers, people who have large tracts of land that otherwise couldn't be subdivided, what it allows that to do is say, well, look, and because you can create this conservation lot, you are now able to create a subdivision lot, and that can help mitigate that cost pressure that the trust feels. I know that having spoken to the board, they have basically, in real terms, their funding has dropped over the last 10 years just because of the inflation, and they haven't had any real increase in government support. So their ability to fund these, we feel, very important projects needs a bit of help from councils where and as they can around potentially, and that doesn't have to be monetary, it just means around development rights might be an appropriate mechanism.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's really a wrap of what we wanted to say to the panel this morning, other than to say that we're available for questions, and thank you so much for the opportunity to appear.
Okay, thank you. Questions from the panel?
Thank you very much. Thank you both. My first question is for the reporting officer. Because your submission around the subdivision on highly productive land, in my Appendix A in track changes, that's struck out. Is that?
So that is correct. So we found that we didn't need a standalone rule for that highly productive land. It could fall to the standard, the general subdivision rule, and then there's a standard later.
Cool, thank you. And just another comment about the MPS for highly productive land, because I've had the luxury of being able to pull it up in front of me, but I had looked at it the other day. Just in relation to mapping, one of the clauses, or sub-clauses, says that regional councils must undertake the mapping required by this clause, and then point C, at a level of detail that identifies individual parcels of land, or, where appropriate for larger sites, parts of parcels of land. So I guess that means that they're going to have to, it's not going to be just the New Zealand, land use inventory, 1 in 100,000 scale, or whatever it happened to be. It's going to have to be more than that when it's completed. And they've got 3 years to do that. So
yes,
yeah. So I take your point, but but I think that they should, if they follow the national policy statement, have it at a reasonably detailed level.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner. I hear what you're saying, and perhaps just a bit of context. It's my understanding in talking to the Regional Council about this, that the question is whether they will simply be rolling over the land resource inventory. So I think that's still on the table.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I understand what you're saying.
Thank you.
I think, just to interrupt, I think during hearing stream 1, the Regional Council let us know that that mapping's been put on hold for a while until they know exactly what changes to the NPS are going to occur in terms.
Yes.
We're aware of that as well, yes.
Whether land use capability class 3 is included.
Exactly.
Sorry, no more questions.
Just a few questions. Just the conservation lot issue.
Yep.
Now, we've been told in the Section 42A report that sort of matters of rules and things could be addressed through submissions on the variation that's just been notified. Have you had an opportunity to look at that variation today? You may not have.
No. I still think, though, that it's appropriate, given that you've included all these other cultural and other, which are all, things that we should be looking to protect, then flora and fauna should be also included, given that it's a Part 2 matter as well in the RMA around protections of these sorts of things. So that's just what I'd say to that.
And that it also forms part of the subdivision chapter more appropriately than the ecological
provisions.
if you're providing for subdivision, which effectively what that would be, you're offsetting a conservation covenant with the ability to determine a subdivisional lot, then it needs to be covered in the subdivision chapter.
Do you mind? Hi, Madam
Yes,
Comment
no,
Officer.
please.
So I have looked at the variation for the ecological eco chapter, and upon review of the submitted evidence, I concur with the recommendation put forward by the submitter, just in terms of tidying up that subdivision rule for the conservation purposes. I think it should include the biodiversity.
Okay, cool. So you'll address it through your reply?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. You didn't, Mr. Shaughnessy, address the commercial industrial zone standard issue?
No, Mr. Chairman, we did not this morning because in between lodging our submission and preparing our evidence and attending the hearing today, that need is no longer pressing in terms of the client interest in that zone.
Oh, okay.
So we've decided not to pursue that
Okay, thank you.
and address it this morning.
In terms of the rural lifestyle zone issue around the averaging things, is there an example that you could provide to demonstrate that?
In terms of the rural or in terms of the large lot residential?
The large lot, I was thinking of the 1,000 square metre.
Well, we could do quite a few different scenarios around where it precludes and where it doesn't. It's a fairly straightforward exercise. There are only 8 sites within that zone that are over 6,000 square metres, which would then be otherwise all other subdivision is non-complying.
We can provide a map showing the availability.
Yeah.
Yep, 100%.
And maybe an example of one of those latter ones you talked about where it would be non-complying to show. That would be helpful in an understanding of the point you're making.
We'll show you both. It might be easier.
So Shaughnessy, what does the NPS for highly productive land say around a transitional arrangement for subdivision and development?
In regard to the mapping, it says that the land resource inventory will stand until such times as the individual regional councils have had an opportunity to do a different scale mapping.
So does that mean the council is obliged to live with the LRI mapping to make its calls?
To a large extent, yes, it forms a background and it forms a platform. But we have worked in a more detailed way with landowners preparing individual property reports. There has been, I have to disclose, there has been a varying level of acceptance of those reports by local authorities, but generally they have been well received. And to the point where we've talked to the Regional Council about providing that mapping to them as part of their remapping of the area, because it's a very valuable, it's a very valuable piece of property.
But in your opinion, there's nothing in the NPS to stop some sort of transitional arrangement, if you like, in the district plan to allow that to be taken on board, that of individual mapping?
Yeah, I think the NPS does touch on that, and I understand that context and appreciate that. It's just on a property by property scale where there is clearly evidence that it's not appropriate for subdivision to be controlled by the LRI, that we have talked to local authorities and reached this position where they will accept an individual paddock scale mapping assessment.
Does the NPS naturally, that's the right word, push subdivision proposals that are in highly productive land as defined by the NPS? Does it push it towards non-complying activity, the old avoid
Yes.
situation?
generally?
Well, there are, of course, there are clauses 8 or specifically clause 10, which provides for exemption. So there is some wriggle room there.
But those exemptions wouldn't apply to the examples.
One did.
I think they do apply to one where there was a water restriction and a dampness factor. Yeah, because it compromised productivity. The long-term 30-year productivity of the land.
I'm just thinking what scope the council has for applying an exemption for, if it's mapped at that parcel by parcel, paddock by paddock kind of level to actually sort of wriggle out of the MPS.
I appreciate that. We would be happy to discuss that with the officers. I do realise that it is a tight regulatory environment, but there might be some middle ground.
No pun intended.
No, none.
I'm not saying whether that's productive or not.
Thank you very much. I don't think I have any more questions. Any questions?
No, thank you. No.
Thank you very much. That was very helpful. Thank you for coming in.
Our pleasure. Thank you.
Time is 12:37 and time is adjourned for lunch. What time will we due back? 1:30. 1:30? Okay, we can make that. Okay, the hearing is adjourned until 1:30. Thank you very much.